Let's be honest here. We all know I'm trying to be one mind syndicate, so let's jump over that. Today we'll be starting the Badab War. Let's start with its origins. The Maelstrom Zone. Situated along the eastern fringe in the Segmentum Ultima, the region of the galaxy, now known as the Maelstrom Zone, was explored during the Great Crusade of the 31st millennium. Second in size and extent only to the Eye of Terror, the Maelstrom is a vast warp rift that scars both the physical universe and the fabric of the Imperium beyond. The Maelstrom covers an area many hundreds of light years across, and its presence in space is marked by a vast, slowly turning gyre comprised of a nebula, dust, and stellar material in which countless stars and worlds have long been lost to the Imperium. During the Great Crusade, the vast armies of the Emperor of Mankind attempted to penetrate the Maelstrom and cleanse it of the evil that lurked within. The wealth of the worlds bordering the Maelstrom has drawn mankind to the Maelstrom Zone time and again, despite its manifold hazards and difficulties. And indeed, there is ready evidence of humanity's presence in the region as far back as the age of technology. The Maelstrom Zone has also drawn humanity's enemies as well in their countless number and diverse loathsome forms. Hundreds of warships and thousands of troops were lost in the early campaigns during the Great Crusade era, and with the rest of the galaxy to reconquer, the Emperor declared the region Purgatus. I wonder what that means, right? In the years following the Horus heresy, Primarch Robotic Gulliman of the Ultramarine Space Marine Legion decided that the inhabitants of the Maelstrom were too great a threat to the shaky stability of the recovering Imperium to ignore, and ordered the surrounding regions reinforced in an effort to contain any attacks that might originate from within. Over time, the Imperium slowly established several important Imperial outposts within the Maelstrom during the 38th and 39th millennia. These outposts rose to prominence as flickering beacons of human influence and strength within the region. The three vital star systems that formed the links in a distant chain that followed the resources of the Maelstrom Zone to flow into the coffers of the more established Imperial sectors beyond were the star system of Changax, Sagan, and Badab. As the situation in the Maelstrom became ever more volatile, this path of Imperial commerce came increasingly under threat. By the mid of the 31st millennium, the heavily militarized hive world of Syngax, located in the star system of the same name, was the most populated planet in the northern Maelstrom Zone. Having long been a linchpin of Imperial control of the Legion, Syngax was a key strategic world, forming a bulk against aggressors and serving as a safe port for Imperial merchant and naval vessels. In the year 555 of the 31st millennia, disaster struck when, within the suddenness of an onrushing storm, Syngax succumbed to corruption from within and attack from without. The planet rapidly fell into bloody civil war between its Imperial garrison and the death cult Nihilist, backed by the intervention of the dreaded Chaos Space Marine warband known as the Reborn. Despite the intervention of the Mantis Warriors Chapter, which itself has made a home in the nearby Endymion cluster subsector, the death toll rose exponentially into the millions. The death cultists managed to gain access to part of the Syngaxian missile defense network, and in a suicidal rage unleashed a rain of atomic and plasma warheads upon the doomed world, shattering its hive cities and disrupting the planet's orbit for several standard years. The resulting permanent nuclear winter, radioactive fallout, and tectonic upheaval annihilated all life on Syngax. With the fall of this key world, Imperial control of the northern Maelstrom Zone swiftly crumbled. Without Sygax, along with other Imperial losses suffered in the region over the previous centuries, vital military supply chains stretching as far as Baka and Terra itself were threatened, forcing the Adeptus Terra to act. Maelstrom Warders. In 587 of the 31st millennia, the High Lords of Terra pronounced an Edict Imperialis in response to the dire predations, ordering several Space Marine chapters to permanently base themselves in the Maelstrom Zone in order to protect the Imperium's interest and pacify the region. In recognition of their past glorious service to the Imperium, the Astral Claws Chapter was given the high honor of the senior role in commanding the newly formed Maelstrom Warders. This force was to include fleet-based Lamenters and Charnel Guard chapters to patrol the outer regions and also incorporate the Mantis Warriors who were based in the nearby Endymion cluster. Once this force was put in place, the Astral Claws took over an orbital battle station in the strategically vital Badab system, which became their fortress monastery and base of operations. After the establishment, a detachment of Imperial Navy squadron were permanently assigned to the region to conduct research and destroy and convey protection duties. This naval detachment quickly stabilized the surrounding areas and purged the inner zone of heretical and xenos elements that had plagued them. Soon the wealth of the Maelstrom Zone once again began to flow into the coffers of the Imperium. The greatest operation during these times occurred during the Scourge campaign from 540 of the 31st millennia to 551, in which the Astral Claws and their allies conducted a series of major combat operations, striking deep into the heart of the Maelstrom in an attempt to take the battle to the foe. Initially, the Space Marines were successful, until the abrupt withdrawal of the Charnel Guard chapter. The Adeptus Terra served the chapter's ties with the Maelstrom Warders, displacing them to the Tantanos Crusade in the Veiled region. The sudden loss effectively ended the campaign. The Astral Claws subsequently petitioned for a replacement chapter to be reassigned, but were denied. Less than 2 solar decades later, the Maelstrom Warders suffered a series of setbacks and a high number of casualties among some of their allies, causing a rift in the relations between the wider Imperium and the Warders during this period. Soon the Warders became hard-pressed by an upsurge of demonic incursions and Corsair attacks, pushing them into an increasingly defensive posture and suspending all operations near the Maelstrom itself. Once again, disaster struck as a series of orc raids originating within the Maelstrom struck deep into the Badab sector. During the Battle of Hell Cities, the Astral Claws... Wait, there's a pointer, whatever. The Astral Claws Chapter Master, Master Vrovik Blake, went against his own doctrine and pursued the orcs back into the Maelstrom itself. Having led the Astral Claws for the last 2 standard centuries, he fell in single combat with the orc war boss Vorg Manburna, forcing the Astral Claws to retreat. On return to the Badab system, the captain of the Astral Claws 3rd Company, Lufgt Huron, was appointed as Chapter Master by popular acclaim of his peers in 750 of the 31st millennium. He became the youngest warrior in the chapter's history to attain this esteemed rank. Imperial historians now point out that such a man of flawed character should never have been allowed to rise to the command of a Space Marine chapter. But Lufgt Huron had already proven to be an exceptional warrior, as well as a skilled tactician and charismatic leader. He quickly organized the chapter's strategic deployment and established a policy of expending his chapter's fleet, which had been badly depleted, including with its ranks captured Corsair vessels in aggressive raids. He also established the questionable Scorched Planet policy against their enemies, and increased his chapter's stockpile of Exterminatus-class weapons. This resulted in several fringe worlds that harbor renegade ships in the past being turned into lifeless husks. Rise of a Tyrant. In 780 of the 31st millennium, a failed coup attempt on the hive world of Badab Primaris led to an abortive civil war, and the Astral Claws stepped in and brutally crushed the conflict. In the aftermath, the elements behind the coup were brought forth to Lufgt Huron for judgment. Mindful of the lesson of Siganax, the Chapter Master personally took matters into his own hands, swiftly reimposing order once more. This time, he employed the Astral Claws much more brutally, as they executed much of the planet's ruling class, as well as purging those they perceived as morally recidivist. Taking upon himself the mantle of planetary ruler, Lufgt Huron stylized himself the Tyrant of Badab, claiming the inhabited world in the proximity to the hospital region of the void around the Badab system as his chapter's fiefdom. In his subsequent pronouncement, he echoed the example and precedent of the sovereign realm of Ultramar and the Maelstrom Warder's charter. The nearby system was soon purged wholesale of the ruling elites, and in the solar decades afterwards, a number of Astral Claws watch bastions were established. The tyrant's chosen servants and political allies were placed in positions of power, turning the Badab sector into a pocket empire commanded by the Astral Claws. To further cement his power in a massive reorganization of the uneven and often isolationist native planetary defense forces in the region into what would become known as the Tyrant's Legion. Following a unified command structure, these forces now follow the standard dictated by Huron. The Astral Claws assigned detachment to further train the Tyrant's Legion in order to purge them of the weak elements. Soon, the Tyrant's Legion proved their worth as they repulsed numerous Corsair raids, freeing the Astral Claws from their defensive stance. The chapter was able to conduct a series of lightning raids into outlying areas to harass and destroy heretic and Xenos-controlled areas. With the increase of Huron's tally of victories, and the curtailing of Corsair activity, and the increase of production never before reached, the fame of the Astral Claws Tyrant grew beyond the Maelstrom Zone. Spurred by his success, Huron has his servants delivered a formal and lengthy petition to Terra, making a detailed case for completely subduing the Maelstrom and the surrounding area, which would greatly benefit the Imperium in the long term. In order to achieve this, Huron advocated the deployment of several more Space Marine chapters to the Maelstrom Warder's ranks, suggesting that a new founding might even be warranted to meet the need of his plan. Unfortunately, Huron's petition was dismissed without full hearing on the grounds that the military requirements of the Imperium were better met elsewhere. Astral Claws falter. During the mid-700s of the 31st millennia, the Astral Claws' submission of required gene seed types to the Magos Inviliga of the Adeptus Mechanicus became infrequent and incomplete. Although initially a cause for concern, such matters were not uncommon, particularly those Space Marine chapters deployed to border areas or on crusade, simply because the chapter itself might have a temporary need to retain the gene seed itself to sustain battlefield losses. But as the omission persisted, this signaled to the Mechanicus that there was some darker motive at work. This will later prove to be true with the Astral Claws, as evidence indicated that the first great sin against the established tradition of the Adeptus Astartes would arguably result in the chapter's fall into heresy. Repeatedly denied the reinforcement he had requested to aid him and the Maelstrom Warders in carrying out their tasks, in his arrogance and pride, the Tyrant of Badab sought to expand his forces into a force equal to a Space Marine legion of old. Further covert investigation would later uncover that the Astral Claws Apothecarian was conducting heretical experiments in rapid gene seed zygote cultivation. Though largely unsuccessful, the Astral Claws eventually stood at around an estimated 3,500 battle brothers strong, a direct violation of the proscriptions laid out in the Codex Astartes. In 729, of course the 31st millennium, Lufgt Huron's servants delivered a formal document of petition to the High Lords of Terra, making a detailed case for the complete purging and subduing the Maelstrom and the surrounding area. In order to achieve this, the document set out the case for massively augmented deployment of Space Marine to the Maelstrom warders. Huron's petition was once again dismissed without a full hearing on the grounds that the Imperium's needs were better met elsewhere. The Badab Schism, 748 to 900. After further requests to redistribute resources from the Maelstrom Zone were denied, and met an increased quota demands from the Administratum, in protest, Huron withheld Badab Primaris' planetary tithe to the Administratum and further blocked the passage of trade through his realm in protest over the Adeptus' failure to provide him and his allies sufficient resources to police the Maelstrom. Refusing the Astral Claws' role as defenders of the Maelstrom, the Tyrant of Badab soon diverted the industrial resources and manpower to directly supplement the Badab sector's defenses, as well as augmenting the Maelstrom fleet detachment and fortification of key worlds under his command. These space-based defenses encircling the outer and inner spheres of the Badab sector came to be known as the Ring of Steel. On Badab Primaris, the tyrant ordered the demolition of the ancient citadel of the ruling Dominars, and instead erected the legendary, hugely fortified Palace of Thorns to his own specifications and designs. The clashing entitlement of the Administratum's Imperial tithe and the ancient rights of the Adeptus Astartes commanders to defend the Imperium by any means necessary swiftly came to be known as the Badab Schism, and would last for more than a standard century and a half, during which the Astral Claws and the Maelstrom Warders would continue to carry on military operations as usual, against a volatile backdrop of worsening tension with the Administratum and Segmentum authorities. The sudden loss of the lifeblood of industry and commerce was keenly felt by the Carthago sector. For more than 11 standard centuries, the Carthan lords and the planetary governors had held the charter to distribute the industrial output of the Maelstrom Zone and guard its passage from the Administratum-controlled supply fortress on Sagan III, and then to the western Segmentum Ultima and beyond. Isolated by vast distances, the Carthan had long grown fat and decadent, protected by the blood and toil of the more strife-torn realms. War on the Horizon, 780 to 900. Free from their inglorious garrison duty, the Astral Claws intervened in the aftermath of the infamous Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, which had troubled the Imperium for many solar decades. Gathering in a mixed task force comprising of various companies from the Astral Claws, Firehawks, White Scars, and Celestial Guard chapters, backed by the Death Corps of Krieg and Colsec Astra Militarum regiments, and of course the Titans from the Legio Venator, Huron was elected a battle leader by common consent. Under his inspired command, the task force ruthlessly eradicated the heavily fortified Lycanthos system of traitors and chaos forces in under a standard year. However, Stibor Lazarek, Chapter Master of the Firehawks, continued to harbor a grudge over the fact that Huron was given overall command, despite his seniority as Chapter Master. This grudge would fester over the coming years until it finally would bear the fruit of bitterness. In 821, a heavy orc raiding force from the Maelstrom was intercepted and destroyed in a series of battles in the Hirab sector in the Endymion cluster by a combined force of the Maelstrom Warders. During the battle, Lufgt Huron slew Raka, the orc war boss, in single combat, and was hailed as a hero of the people of Endymion. In 869, at instigation of their chapter master, the Black Templars declared a crusade of wrath into the Maelstrom, assaulting it from the eastward approach. Meanwhile, the Astral Claws, Lamenters, and Mantis warriors launched their own assault from the south and northeast approach. Thanks in no small part to Huron's brilliant strategic planning, as well as the mettle of the Maelstrom's warders and the Black Templars, they achieved a stunning victory against 23 alien or heretic stronghold worlds. Unfortunately, wider events intervened once again, putting a premature end to the Astral Claws' plans, as the Black Templars were called away to aid the beleaguered realms of Ultramar in the wake of the First Tyrannic War. Having already suffered substantial losses in the campaign, the Maelstrom Wanderers chapters were forced to withdraw from the Maelstrom, much to Huron's fury. During this time, Lufgt Huron was uncharacteristically taciturn and withdrawn on his return from the Maelstrom, either locking himself away in the chapter's archives for solar days on end and refusing to see anyone, or keeping long silent vigils alone in the fortress monastery Panopantic Solar, gazing unblinkingly for hours at the holospheres that depicted the Maelstrom Zone. Some observers say that it was during this time that Huron became corrupted and fell from grace. Denied the goals he had spent a lifetime fighting for, he had been denied his glory as it was snatched from his hands at the last second, by those he should call master. Finally unhinged him, or maybe he had given in to the hubris and false pride. Some of the tyrant's detractors have even gone so far as to suggest that during the Crusade of Wrath, whilst deep within the nightmare realm of the Maelstrom, something vile or warp-tainted promises had wormed their way into his heart. Matters worsened once again, not only within the Maelstrom Zone, but the wider Imperium as well, as the threat of High Fleet Behemoth left the defenses of the Segmentum Ultima in disarray, and wars and rumors of wars as far as the Eye of Terror and the Ghoul Stars threatened to erupt, as well as galaxy-wide revolts and other strange phenomena. Soon, crisis followed crisis, and in the dying years of the 1800s, of course 31st millennium, Huron saw the Maelstrom Zone slipping from his grasp, and all the victories the Maelstrom warriors had gained began to crumble. And so, in an attempt to tighten his grip, he remained unaware that elsewhere events were moving against him. It would not be long before the brooding Tyrant of Badab would spark into violence, and the Imperium would once again shed the blood of its own. Shadows of War. Destruction of the Tite Fleet. With preliminary judgment into the Badab system and the Segmentum Court's temporal weighing in the Administratum's favor, an Imperial investigation fleet, including representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus Biologists in Vila and the Administratum's Lords of the Carthago sector, was sent to Badab to demand the delivery of the Badab Tite and the chapter's gene seed requirements. In circumstances that cannot be fully confirmed or explained, the investigation fleet was fired upon and destroyed in its entirety as it attempted to force its way through the Badab system's so-called Ring of Steel in order to press its demands. No ship survived, and more than 20,000 servants of the Imperium were lost. Soon, claim and counterclaim ensued in the aftermath as to how this tragedy occurred, and Huron, delivering his own Dominion's report on the Badab matter to the Segmentum authorities, adamantly insisted that the fleet was fired upon only after refusing to give way to the just authority of the system's master. Within the Carthago sector, outrage at the incident quickly became widespread, and soon such trade links that had remained between the Maelstrom Zone and the Carthago sector were abruptly severed or subject to the harshest scrutiny. The Carthan sector governor, Tanit Koenig, moved to heavily censure the Astral Claws Chapter, along with calls for the arrest and trial of Huron for such treachery against the Imperium. With the weight of suffering and bloodshed elsewhere, the tangle of claim and counterclaim fell on deaf ears. In addition, Huron was the lawful master of a realm permanently on a war footing, a bulwark against the Xenos and Chaos, and, on the most basic level, authorized to defend those domains. Without hard evidence, a charge of willful and premeditated homicide against the Imperium servants would be almost impossible to prove in this case. Over the next 3 standard years, the Cartan Imperial commanders took it upon themselves to send 2 further punitive expeditions into the Maelstrom Zone, but both fleets were lost in unconfirmed circumstances, supposedly never reaching the Badab system. The intervention of the Astral Claws and their allies was suspected. Unable to enforce their will decisively, the increasingly desperate Cartan lords, near bankrupted by this stage, attempted to circumvent Badab itself, taking the far longer and more perilous route in order to access the lost ties directly to make up their shortfall. By 903, the agents of the Cartan Imperial commanders began to spread propaganda in both the Segmentum Astartes and the Senatorium Imperialis to any that would listen. As the local sector administratum continued to press the High Lords of Terra to intervene directly, the Maelstrom warders proceeded to arm themselves for war and conducted sweeps of the Maelstrom Zone in force, while they simultaneously continued to augment their defenses within the Badab sector. Maelstrom Succession 903. To answer the continuing threats to the control of his domain, Huron issued the infamous Articles of Just Succession, which were also signed and ratified by the Masters of the Lamenters and Mantis Warriors chapters. These documents were designed to morally sever the Maelstrom Zone's direct ties to its neighboring sectors. In support of their cause, the documents cited both the Imperial edict that founded the Maelstrom Warders and the ancient rights and ties of the Adeptus Astartes prerogative in their defense, precedents that both weighed heavily in their favor. These articles also called for a full investigation into the Carthago sector, asserting the historic and lawful sovereignty of the Space Marine chapters involved from outside interference by the lower Adepta, and stated again their willingness to defend the Maelstrom Zone from any who would threaten it. As the situation devolved further, the Cartans threatened all-out war, but lacked the means to do so alone. Instead, they petitioned aid to mount an attack from the Departamento Monitorum and the Segmentum Naval Subcommand at Riza, but were flatly refused and informed that the matter was an internal dispute. Met with denials, the Carthago sector itself drafted increasingly large numbers of troops into its planetary defense forces regiments. To further their goal, the Cartan satrap sent several direct and open appeals to several Space Marine chapters with whom they had past dealings with. The satrap had quickly realized that only other Space Marines can truly hope to contest their fellow transhuman Astartes in open battle. The Firehawks chapter was the first to respond to their cause. I wonder why. Badab War. Breaking of the Storm. 904. At the direct request of the Carthago sector's ruling satrap, elements of the Firehawks chapter of the Adeptus Astartes were sent to investigate the disappearance of the Cartan shipping in the areas to the galactic south of the Golgothan Wastes, which border the northern regions of the Maelstrom Zone. In the past, the Firehawks chapter had used the vast orbital dockyards of the Cartan capital world of Sidon Ultra for resupply. The volatile and bellicose nature of the Firehawks chapter was widely known, and it is likely that this also figured in the Cartan satrap reasoning in making her request. This monumental arrogance and folly would soon prove disastrous. Conducting search and destroy operations in the Golgothan Waste, Knight Commander Stibor Lazarek, he agreed to dispatch several starships into the northern Maelstrom Zone. One such vessel, the Red Harbinger, entered the Endymion cluster in 904. This ancient region of space was under the stewardship of the Mantis Warriors chapter. one of the Astartes chapters that belonged to the alliance of the Maelstrom Warders. When the Red Harbinger entered the Gallian system, they are intercepted and surrounded by Mantis warriors' vessels. Ever fierce and proud, they were goaded by the Firehawks' refusal to allow them to board and threats of reprisal and open fire, crippling the lone cruiser. With a single act, the full-scale conflict between Space Marine chapters that was to follow was ignited. The Mantis warriors boarded and captured the Red Harbinger, but the engagement was brutal to the extreme as both sides took heavy casualties. Less than 20 Firehawks were captured alive, and none surrendered, but the struggle brought time for an astropathic message to be dispatched to their chapter, warning of their fate and who they had fought. Upon learning of the fate of the Red Harbinger, Chapter Master Lufgt and his entire Firehawks chapter became incensed and withdrew their forces from the operations already underway. The entire chapter fleet deployed within the utmost haste to the Maelstrom Zone. Soon, matters escalated upon the arrival of the Firehawks, as they were met at Gallian by a task force consisting of both Mantis warriors and Astral Claw warships. In a tense standoff, the captives were eventually returned, and both sides traded threats. The Firehawks finally withdrew to await the arrival of their full force, and especially their massive mobile star fortress, the Raptorus Rex. The Firehawks chapter fleet rendezvoused in the Sagan system, and aided by their Cartarian allies, soon launched a series of probing attacks and reconnaissance missions towards the Badab sector and the Endymion cluster. But by doing so, escalated tensions to the point that the situation was rapidly proving untenable. Having prepared for war for many standard years, the Tyrant of Badab and his warriors were battle-hardened, and had the advantage of being intimately familiar with the territory of the Maelstrom Zone. The Mantis warriors proved to be impossible to pin down due to their superlative guerrilla tactics that they employed. Using the Cartans to distract the Astral Claw forces in the Badab sector, the Firehawks struck the agri-world of Ibilis at the edge of the Endymion cluster, attacking civilian targets and burning great swaths of crops, and landed in order to antagonize the Mantis warriors into fighting them in open battle. Unfortunately, this type of attack had been anticipated and planned for by the secessionists. As the Mantis warriors pinned the Firehawks in place on Ibilis with their hit-and-run tactics, the secessionist fleet was able to draw their forces away from Sagan. A combined force of the Astral Claws and Lamenter's chapter soon descended upon the Sagan system and decisively overwhelmed the planetary defense forces and Cartan troops. Badly mauled, the stranded Firehawks and Cartan mortal troops found themselves cut off from supply and behind enemy lines. This forced the Firehawks to withdraw from the Iblis system as they ranked the surface of the planet one final time and successfully punched through the secessionist blockade that was attempting to pin them in. The Firehawks' Raptorus Rex claimed the life of the secessionist Maelstrom Squadron's only Mars-class battlecruiser, Sacred Tentrak. In the process, when the warship's mighty Nova Cannon proved unable to prevail against the formidable Star Fortress. A lull descended upon the region following these tumultuous events as the secessionists consolidated their gain and the Cartans retreated in disarray. Soon the Firehawks, heavily outnumbered and outgunned, were forced into a long period of retreat to the Maelstrom Zone's fringes, which lasted until the late 904, when the Marines' Errant chapter answered the call of the Firehawks for reinforcements. This chapter diverted a sizable force of 6 companies and a fleet of support vessels in order to aid their brother Astartes, although their precise motivation for doing so remains obscured. But soon the Starfaring chapter quickly became bogged down protecting Imperial shipping along the Pale Stars region and the outlying Maelstrom Zone's colonies as the secessionists renewed their offensive. The Marines' Errant split their forces in an effort to guard the convoys in transit from the increasingly frequent secessionist raids and attacks. Matters soon became more complicated when the Marines errant were caught between the Firehawks' desire to destroy Huron's forces at any cost and the growing need to protect Imperial shipping and the outlying Carthago sector's colonies from the marauding secessionist forces. This difficulty was further complicated by a conflict of interest due to the ancient ties of loyalty and blood in the Marines errant that the Marines errant had forged with the Lamenter's chapter, which they had fought besides as recently as the Corinth Crusade, but now faced as enemies. This led to incidents where the Marines errant failed to try to do more than drive off the Lamenter's forces during raids, and in which both parties gave quarter to the other, raising the mutual ire of their respective allies. I'm sorry, that's just too funny. Towards the year's end, matters worsened as an even greater number of star systems were drawn into the rapidly escalating war. The Firehawks and their Cartan allies continued to suffer heavy losses in battle. Soon a dozen worlds had fallen in short order to secessionist control, succumbing to direct secessionist assault or by diplomatic submission to prevent a slaughter of civilians. By the end of 904, worse developments for the Cartans and their allies appeared in the form of the notoriously grim and independent Executioners Chapter. News had reached the Marines errant that the Executioners had announced their intention to support the secessionist cause, and payment of an ancient blood oath given by their chapter to the Astral Claws. The Executioners sent their mighty warship Night Hag with a full augmented company of Astartes to aid the secessionists. Desperate Cartan satrap Tanit Koenig was forced to take drastic action as her own tides and supplications to the procurate generals of the Adeptus Terra were long overdue. Nearly bankrupted by their sector's losses in the war, and with their fleet anchorage at Sagantry now in the hands of the secessionists, the Cartan Imperial commanders mounted a final attempt to harvest the resources needed to meet their own Imperial tides from the nearby worlds of Vainiha and Himara, before secessionists could claim these worlds as their own. Unfortunately, the secessionist intelligence network had already ascertained every detail of the supposedly secret convoy and laid a carefully prepared trap, allowing the Cartan convoy to take on the vast amount of wealth awaiting them at Vainia before they were attacked as they were preparing to transit into the warp. The secessionist forces, comprised mainly of elements from both the Astral Claws and Lamenter's chapter fleet, were led by Huron himself. The Cartan convoy was encircled, and then taken one vessel at a time in a series of ferocious ship-to-ship boarding actions. Over the 24 vessels were taken, as secessionist prizes for almost no losses sustained by the attacking forces. Only through the brilliant leadership of Lieutenant Commander Anton Navarez was the Marines errant capital ship Star Jackal able to escape the Tyrant of Badab's cunning trap, fighting its way clear while sustaining heavy damage. By a twist of fate, the damage sustained in this battle caused the Star Jackal and his brilliant commander to fall behind the Marines errant's pursuit of the Mantis warriors to the world of Bellerophon's Fall. It will be there that many of the chapter's commanders and senior officers were to die. The Astral Claws fought the Firehawks back to the edge of the Golgothian waste, focusing all their attentions on eliminating the chapter altogether. The Astral Claws succeeded in inflicting further serious casualties on the chapter, which could no longer be considered an effective fighting force. To make matters worse for the Imperial loyalists, the Marines errant chapter was drawn toward the industrial moon of Bellerophon's Fall by the Mantis warriors. The two chapters engaged in fierce combat, but the Mantis warriors managed to isolate and entrap the Marines errant 1st and 3rd companies in the Rust Zone, destroying much of their command structure in a series of murderous surgical strikes. The Marines errant were decimated and forced to retreat in disarray. After the deadly battle, it fell to Lieutenant Commander Navarez to mount a rescue mission, in which he succeeded in saving the besieged survivors in a daring counter-raid. In the aftermath of this tragedy, it would also fall to Navarez to take the reins of leadership as the Marines Errant's chapter's last surviving senior officer in the war. Anton Navarez would later somehow manage to reform the Marines Errant contingent into an effective fighting force once more, although they returned as a mere shadow of their former strength. Facing bitter recrimination in the light of this tragedy, the alliance between the Firehawks and the Marine Errants all but collapsed. The secessionist forces would continue to make major advances throughout the rest of the year, almost unopposed. The Maelstrom Zone now belonged, almost wholly, to Huron, the Tyrant of Badab. Eye of the High Lords, 905. With different chapters of Space Marines now embroiled in open warfare with the 6th en route along with various naval detachments, local defense armies, and the sectarian forces of various adepta now involved in what was rapidly accelerating to become the greatest conflict of its kind since the infamous Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, the Imperium's high authorities finally acted. A triumvirate of the Imperial legates were dispatched under the seal of the High Lords of Terra to pronounce judgment over the ongoing strife in the Maelstrom Zone, under orders to leave no stone unturned. Inquisition investigations swiftly uncovered a damning chain of evidence concerning Huron's activities and those of the Astral Claws. Multiple charges were laid against the Tyrant of Badab, ranging from their scarcity of returned gene seed tites to the Legion building to damning evidence of the Astral Claws' direct involvement in attacks on Imperial ships. The Terran legates quickly pronounced that the Badab secession to be a matter of the Imperium's security rather than a civil conflict. They issued an immediate demand for the unconditional ceasefire of all parties and the surrender of the secessionists. Huron immediately rejected their demands. As a result, the Terran legates issued orders for the immediate arrest, pending trial of all chapter masters of the secessionist chapters and the seizure pending judgment of their homeworld's goods, records, and chattels by whatever force was deemed necessary. The Imperium now officially turned against the Tyrant of Badab and all who stood with him. As for the Cartans, their own role in contributing to and worsening the unfolding events of the succession smacked at best of gross arrogance, but more likely wanton ambition and misrule. Legatian investigations carried out on Segmentum Ultima, capital of the Carthago sector, confirmed these suspicions. They found the Imperial commander and Cartan sector governor, Satrap Tanit Koenig, culpable for provoking the war, and she and the world she commanded were brutally punished. Tanit Koenig and her ruling clique were subsequently executed, and the Cartans were made to pay for their transgressions, with the entire 14 billion strong population of Segmentum Ultima committed to indentured servitude for 6 generations in payment for their outstanding debt. Full-scale administratum rectifications, audits, and Adeptus Arbitus moral enforcement pogroms soon began moving outwards across the Carthago sector, as the tight costs and reparations to the Adeptus Astartes were extracted forcibly from the Cartan world, as a process that is still ongoing to the present day. The armed cross-sector conflict and its causes, however, remain unresolved, and the war continued unabated. The Loyalist Gather. A major deployment of Space Marine forces was brought into the war at the Inquisitorial Legate Jardins Farron's request to enforce their authority. The Red Scorpions chapter formed the greatest part of the Loyalist Space Marine force, backed by battle companies drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, Fire Angels, and the surviving members of the Firehawks and Marines Errant chapters. These later chapters were ordered to stand down from independent operations and submit to the High Lords of Terra's authority. Though Inquisitor Frayne had theoretical command of the forces prosecuting the Legonites' missions orders on behalf of the High Lords, the overall tactic command of the unified Space Marine forces fell to Lord High Commander Vernat Ortiz of the Red Scorpions as Magister Militum. a first among equals with the commanders of the other Space Marines contingents. Given their inherent dangers in dealing with conflicts between Space Marine chapters and their relative autonomy from direct Imperial control, the Inquisitor Legate Friaren had little choice but to go along with the decision of the gathered Space Marine commanders. Yet he obviously would have preferred a commander from a more trackable chapter, as the Red Scorpions were famously independent-minded and occasionally factitious chapter in their own right. Lord Commander Ortius's first command was to deploy his own Red Scorpions along with the bulk of the Battlefleet Solar warships to conduct a series of offensive strike and feints into the secessionist-controlled regions to gouge the resistance. This resulted in the heaviest naval engagement of the war to date. At the decisive Battle of Silent Reach in early 906, when cruiser squadrons of the Maelstrom and Lamenter's fleets clashed with the Segmentum Solar and the Red Scorpion's warships in the barren void between the Gallian and Grief Star systems. This engagement proved inconclusive, with both sides suffering damage, but few losses of any major warships by both sides. The only serious loss sustained was by the Maelstrom's fleet's flagship, the Overlord-class battlecruiser Gauntlet of Wrath. The Secessionist fleet broke off from the engagement into the warp soon afterwards, leaving the Loyalists to claim a tentative victory. A dozen such engagements occurred in a short space of time during this period. The Loyalists quickly succeeded in checking and containing the Secessionist advance in the early part of 906, especially with the addition of the remaining Marines Errant and Firehawks forces after they were cleared of heretical or seditious intent. In pursuing this strategy across a broad front, hoping to reveal a weakness in the Secessionist defenses, the Loyalists soon discovered, quite remarkably, that no such weaknesses were apparent. Thus the Loyalists were forced to change their strategy. Firebomb of Sanskrita, 905. Burn them all. The God Emperor will know his own. Stibor Lazarek, Grand Master of the Firehawks, during the firebombing of Sanskrita. Before they submitted to the Legate's will, the Firehawks had one last act of bloody vengeance to carry out, which has since been entered into the Imperial history of the war as the infamous firebombing of Sanskritan. In what is widely regarded as strategically wasteful and vainglorious assault, the bitter Lazarek used his surviving chapter fleet, led by the Raptorus Rex, to conduct a retaliatory orbital assault on the frontline planet of Sanskristan, a sovereign world on the edge of the Endymion cluster. Over a period of several solar days and nights, the Firehawks chapter fleet systematically laid waste to the planet's few cities, slaughtering their inhabitants before they finally withdrew from the system, leaving the planet aflame, wiping out more than 90% of its population. Vinaya raids. Lord Commander Ortiz' next valuable target of opportunity presented itself in the form of the Vinaya system. Vinaya was an important world and served as the gatehouse along one of the secondary warp routes around the rim of the Maelstrom. Furthermore, its defenses and garrison were weaker than the heavily reinforced Sagan system. There were further intelligence reports indicating that the secessionist-occupied world was awash in civil unrest, which might be stirred up in an open revolt by a loyalist attack. While the Firehawks and the newly arrived Raptors chapter conducted patrol and escort operations, the Red Scorpions, Marines Errant, and Nova Marines conducted a three-pronged raid on the Vinaya system, with the target of damaging its production capacity and orbital transships platforms. This would effectively weaken the secessionist grip on the system. Confronting the reformed and reorganized Badab sector human auxilia of the Tyrant's Legion in open warfare for the first time, the Loyalist Space Marines had greatly underestimated them, and as a result, their strike groups were largely prevented from achieving many of their goals in the first raid. Only 4 orbital platforms were taken out of action, and though they managed to damage Vanaya's manufacturing complexes, production was not significantly affected. Data intercepted from the Vanaya Command Vox network, however, revealed the price of the Tyrant's Legion resistance, with the Loyalists inflicting a greater than 178 to 1 kill ratio. In 906, the Red Scorpion forces conducted the last of Vanaya's raids, which proved particularly bloody for the Tyrant's Legion. The Red Scorpions invaded the Kalian industrial hive city with the specific goal of inflicting mass casualties on the human defenders and picking off their Astral Claws Masters when they were found within their ranks. Despite the attacks, the Successionists maintained control of Vanaya, and shortly afterwards, further ill news came to the Loyalists, informing them that several military convoys from the rear supply lines from the Carthago sector had been attacked and scattered by an unknown warship that later proved to be the Night Hag of the Executioner's chapter. They also received more disturbing news in regards to the fate of the fortress world of Sangrada, deep within the Maelstrom Zone. Refusing to bend their knee to the Tyrant of Badab, this fiercely independent world had held out against the Successionist fleet, but Cerngrad, that's the correct way I guess, Cerngrad had partly succumbed due to treachery from within, and Huron's forces now controlled the northern citadels. Remaining too deep within enemy territory to mount an effective relief operation, the prospect of the ancient fortress world falling to Successionist control proved to be a grim prospect for the Loyalists for a future siege. Betrayal at Grief, 906. After the Vanaya campaign, there was a brief lull in the constant fighting, an impasse that was unexpectedly broken by the Successionists with a remarkable proposal. Personally sending his emissary to the Loyalists, Huron offered a temporary ceasefire and honorable parley with the Magister Militum in order to avoid further bloodshed between the two parties. Despite the Inquisitor Legate's strong objection, Lord High Commander Ortiz agreed to the meeting, trusting Huron's word as a fellow Chapter Master to maintain the truce. Ortiz had also equally promised to show his intention to remain iron in his resolve to carry out the judgment of the High Lords. The parley was arranged to take place on an abandoned way station in the orbit around the gas giant Shedim, in the outer reaches of the uninhabitable Grief system. Reconstructed from the damaged and recovered records, what occurred next remains a point of contention and stubborn enigma to the present day. The void station was located on an asteroid mass, abandoned some centuries before due to solar flare activity. Each party consisted of their own respective leaders and their chosen honor guard, which was deposited on the asteroid by Thunderhawk. Upon the opening of negotiations, it was readily apparent that it quickly devolved into an acronymous and volatile atmosphere. Huron, who was in an imperious mood, commenced by ranting against the Maelstrom Warder's supposed contravention of Imperial law. He also went into ranting diatribe against his enemies and their perceived enormities and insults. Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors was also present with Huron's party, whom swiftly accused the Firehawks chapter of perpetrating wanton crimes of genocide. For his part, Lord High Commander Vernat Ortiz stood firm, reiterating the legatine right of authority and the unassailable right of summons. Soon, an adjournment was called for, as the talks became heated, and both parties withdrew to separate compartments on the voice station to confer with their fellows. Matters of record remain regarding the following incident becomes muddled and contradictory. Loyalist communication to their strike cruisers was suddenly cut off as 3 unknown vessels attacked from concealed position deep within the thick atmosphere of the gas giant Shedim. These attackers assaulted the asteroid base before either Loyalist or Successionist vessels could respond, ranking the way station with a devastating salvo of weapon fire, before boarding with an invading party comprised of heretics, mutants, and other renegades. In the ensuing melee, the Loyalist delegation, including Lord Commander Ortis, was killed, and several members of Huron's party, including Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, were also slain. During the three-way space battle around the way station, the Red Scorpion's chief librarian, Severin Lot, valiantly launched a counterattack and recovered his fallen Chapter Master's remains. The Red Scorpions clashing with both the Raiders and Huron's Astral Claws before both sides broke free from the disintegrating asteroid base to avoid certain death. Severin Lot had saved the honor of his chapter, against all odds, and in doing so wrote an enduring legend for himself despite the bitter blow the Red Scorpions had suffered. During the reluctant chaos, the Tyrant of Badab had somehow made his escape early on, and what hand he had in the deaths of Lord Commander Ortis or even Chapter Master Sartak cannot be confirmed. In the aftermath, this incident, which became to be referred as the betrayal at Grief, many within Loyalist ranks blamed Huron's perfidy for the attack, claiming it as rank treachery, while the secessionists laid the blame at the fleet of the Inquisition as a plot to assassinate the Tyrant of Badab by covert means. Inquisitor Legate Jardice Frarin, concluded that the incident may have been due to the possible intervention of third parties of malefic design who wished to benefit from the continuation of the war as the whole region descended into bloodshed and anarchy. Frain also did not rule out the possibility that the plot was carried out by Huron himself in order to assassinate his erstwhile ally, Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors. Ortiz' death merely served to seal the assassination in a shroud of doubt for friend and foe alike. Evidence from that tie have been uncovering of growing disquiet among the Mantis Warriors and their support for the secessionist cause. Committed as they were to protecting their fellow Maelstrom Warders from outside aggressions and defending their sacred independence and rights of the Adeptus Astartes, they still saw the direct judgment of the High Lords of Terra as something not to be disregarded. Rumors concerning the rule of the Astral Claws within their own domains had begun to circulate and had been the cause of disquiet for some time. Sartak's death more than likely served to ensure the Mantis Warriors' resolve, particularly if it could be laid at the feet of an enemy chapter. So much the better if that enemy would blame the Mantis Warriors for the death of their own. Now the possibility of rapprochement between the two opposing sides had been effectively destroyed. The war soon escalated even further, with no quarter given by the Red Scorpions or Astral Claws. Soon secrets would be uncovered that would lend to the cause of the secessionists an even darker hue. A new leader. 906. With the death of Red Scorpion's Chapter Master and Loyalist Magister Militum, Verant Ortis, the strategic initiatives was temporarily delivered into the hands of the secessionists, and raids against Imperial shipping increased. For a time, the Loyalists were sorely pressed to hold what little ground they had taken in the Maelstrom Zone. The Pale Stars were all but entirely cut off, and heavy Space Marine escort forces were required in order to maintain access to the worlds of the Gallian and the Chimarga. The situation was finally eased with the arrival of contingents of the Howling Griffins, Nova Marines, and later Sons of Medusa chapters, and the appointment of Karbal Kun, the new Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions, as the new Magister Militum of the Loyalist forces. As his chapter defines such things, Cullen had grown forthright, proud, and above all fiercely loyal to the Red Scorpions during his illustrious career. For this reason, Cullen was viewed as the natural successor of Lord High Commander Verant Ortis. During the Badab War, his transition to the position of Lord High Commander and Magister Militum after the death of Ortis on the world of Grief at the hands of the Renegade Astral Claws was greeted with wide acclaim by his battle brothers, and most importantly, blessed by the chapter's chief librarian, Severin Lot, who oversaw the change of command and quelled any dissent. Cullen's accession had been contested primarily by the Firehawk's Chapter Master, Stibor Lazarek, who demand that he instead should be granted overall command of the Loyalist forces in the conflict as Magister Militum, due to his seniority and long honorable service to the Imperium. As Orti's successor, Cullen was entitled to step into the mantle of his predecessor as Magister Militum and overall commander of the Loyalist forces. But this was by no means guaranteed. With the principal support of the Raptors and Salamanders chapters, as well as his own impassioned pleas in the Loyalist War Council that he had the right of vengeance and the proven mettle required to see the war to its end, Cullen secured the support of the Fire Angels and Nova Marines for his command. Both the Sons of Medusa and the Marines Errant chapters then agreed to his selection for reasons of their own. Despite some continued minor dissent, Karab Cullen was acclaimed as the second Magister Militum of the Imperial Crusade to retake the Maelstrom Zone from the Successionists. Cullen quickly took control of the situation and brought forward plans to convert the old way station of the largely abandoned mining world of Hallows Point into the first primary Loyalist base and staging point in the Maelstrom Zone proper. With starships and materials moved into the system with great dispatch, Vengeance Station, as it became known, was fully operational in under a standard year. The Loyalists retook the offensive initiative even before Vengeance Station was completed. Soon, a renewed phase of aggressive operations was ready to take place, with the Red Scorpions chapter particularly eager for battle. However, their eagerness was tempered by their new master and the wise council of Chief Librarian Servin Lot, who promised their battle brothers a bloody but carefully considered retribution. Loyalist Redeployment 906. By the close of 906, dozens of separate void actions had already been fought by the Red Scorpions detachments, ranging from defending convoys to raiding outposts and intercepting secessionist shipping alongside the Raptors, turning the tide against Huron's raiders for the first time. At the same time, the Loyalists were bolstered by fresh forces from the Nova Marines and Sons of Medusa chapters, who immediately carried out probing attacks into the region of the Endymion cluster and against the edges of the Saga system, maintaining pressure on the secessionists and keeping their forces pinned down. During this new campaign, the Loyalists garrisoned the barren Chimara system and established several outposts and listening stations in order to conduct sustained operations in the contested Gargatea system. Gargatea 3. Hope I don't have to pronounce this a lot. Gargatea 3 was a feral world of poisonous fens and corrosive jungles. This heavily contested world soon turned into a savage battleground as the Raptors, Salamanders, and Fire Angels chapter clashed against the Astral Claws and Mantis warriors amidst the tangled and often lethal vegetation. The war on Gargatea swiftly developed into a series of hit-and-run engagements of ambush and counterattack. The battle lines on Gargatea remained non-linear, save for a few scattered landmarks of half-overrun explorator bases and old smugglers' outposts. The outcome of such vicious fighting was uncertain, and a high amount of casualties were sustained on both sides. Gargatea remained a constant world of vital strategic importance due to the planet being one of the few life-sustaining worlds in the region. The secessionist forces were finally displaced from this planet at the end of 907, and the system reclaimed for the Loyalists. Loyalist Reinforcement 907. With the arrival of fresh reinforcements to replace them in the order of battle, the Marines Errant first took up reserve duty for the remainder of 906, before they finally withdrew entirely from the Badab War in early 907, with some acrimony attached to their departure. The Firehawks chapter, who grew increasingly embittered, were forcibly retired to the rear guard for a time by the newly appointed Magister Militum, Lord High Commander Karab Cullen, in order to avoid further trouble in the ranks of the Loyalist forces. This redeployment of the Firehawks was proved particularly effective, as the presence of the mighty Raptorus Rex at the Hallows Point ensured the security of the Loyalist facility while under construction. The presence of the mobile Star Fortress soon proved vital when Hallows Point was raided in late 906 by secessionist vessels led by a trio of Lamenter's Chapter strike cruisers. The attack was repulsed without major damage to the half-finished base, and Anchorage, as the concentrated firepower of both the Raptorus Rex and the Red Scorpion's battle barge, Sword of Ordon, proved a decisive factor. The scales began to tip in the Loyalists' favor, as further reinforcements arrived almost solar month by solar month, with missives from the Adeptus Terra, informing them that the other Space Marines chapter were en route. Lord High Commander Cullen knew that he must press his advantage soon, or risk the war devolving into a slow battle of attrition that would bleed his forces dry. The first move forwards would be the relief of the fortress world of Surengarad that stubbornly held out against the secessionist aggression by their heroic self-sacrifice and single bloody-minded faith in the God Emperor. The Raptors and Salamanders chapters were assigned the task of intervention by sending a select strike force dispatched on a long-range incursion mission behind the secessionist lines. The Raptors covertly landed a strong force of Battle Brothers in field-modified armor over 300 kilometers away from their chosen target. Shunning heavy gear and vehicles in favor of reduced visibility to auspex and thermal detectors, the Raptors' war party launched a lightning assault under the cover of blinding gale, and succeeded in breaching the fortress walls of the main orbital defense complex with meltabombs, gaining entrance. They then successfully sabotaged the base's weapon silo, despite taking heavy casualties from a bitterly contested counterattack by the Astral Claws. With the way open, the two chapters' battle barges bombarded the planet from the upper atmosphere, smashing the secessionist-held positions into surrender and liberating Sovngarde. The liberation of Sovngarde marked the turning point in the war, as the Loyalists began to drive a potential wedge down the middle of the secessionist worlds. But before they could take an advantage of this new gain, dire news came from the Howling Griffins stationed at Kirma. Of a deadly new threat. Huron's sins uncovered. 907, surprisingly. Inquisitorial interrogation of an Astral Claws apothecary captured during the battle for Sovngarde's polar fortress revealed to the general shock of the interrogators that the prisoner was not in fact an Astral Claw by origin at all, but was in fact a former member of the Tiger Claws, a chapter long thought lost. The Astral Claws' hubris resulted in their chapter secretly absorbing the remnants of their long-lost successor chapter into their ranks, and ultimately led to Huron's dream of expanding his chapter into a force with the strength of one of the Space Marine legions of antiquity, in order to pacify the Maelstrom permanently and crush mankind's enemies. Some Imperial scholars contend that when the last remaining Tiger Claws survivors were taken into the Astral Claws' midst, these once loyal brothers grasped the poisonous viper to their hearts, thus causing them to eventually fall from grace. Further dire and extreme interrogative methods were then unleashed in utter secrecy, as a planned series of stalk and capture raids were engaged upon by covert Astartes and Inquisition forces operating within the Maelstrom Zone. Evidence was quickly amassed of an unforeseen and terrible heresy that had been pursued by the Astral Claws and Huron for more than a standard century. The Tyrant of Badab had ordered the withholding of his chapter's gene seed tides to the Magos Invigia, whatever, I forgot how I used to pronounce this, not to replenish the chapter's own losses, but at first in order to help save the remnants of the decimated ranks of their near-extinct kin, the Tiger Claws chapter, which had sought sanctuary with them in secret. Huron and his hid them within the Astral Claws' own ranks. He then further compounded this sin by seeking to expand his own forces far past the levels mandated by the Codex Astartes. For at least 100 standard years before the outbreak of the conflict, the Astral Claws secretly attempted to transform their chapter slowly into a force equal to a Space Marine Legion of old. In his monumental arrogance and pride, Huron sought at first not to rebel against the Imperium, but to prove his case by scourging the Maelstrom clean and establishing a new realm carved out for mankind in the name of the Emperor. To outside scrutiny, the Tyrant of Badab placed Astral Claws detachments within the Tyrant's Legion's ranks before the outbreak of the war as trainers, tasked with the purging and improvement of the mediocre and often corrupt PDF armies of the Badab sector. But in reality, the Legion's Astartes tribunes were in all cases passed off as the force's commanders. This perfidy succeeded in concealing the true numbers of the Tyrant's growing chapter from prying eyes, and enabled the Astral Claws to disperse these hidden forces all across Huron's domain, hidden within the Tyrant's Legion. The perfidy of the Tyrant of Badab and the Astral Claws rapidly became apparent when the Badab War engulfed the Maelstrom Zone, as did the identity of the true commanders of the Tyrant's Legion, who willingly followed their master without falter, taking up arms against any who would challenge the Tyrant's domain. Further covert investigation uncovered that the Astral Claws apothecaries had also been conducting heretical experiments in rapid gene seed zygote cultivation. While largely unsuccessful, thanks to the use of its untied gene seed, the Astral Claws Chapter stood at around an estimated 3,500 battle brothers strong. The axe fall at Kimara. That's worse than Jihera. Here we stand, and here we shall die, unbroken and unbowed. Though the very hand of death itself come for us, we will spit our defiance to the end. Revered Ancient Arman Titus of the Howling Griffins Chapter during the last stand of Kimara Ellipsis. A disastrous defeat for the Loyalist forces in early 907 would make the bloodiest year of the conflict, for the bulk of the Executioner's Chapter had arrived in force in the Maelstrom Zone and immediately conducted an immediate surprise attack at Kimara. They succeeded in destroying the Loyalist outposts, listening stations, and the vital astropathic relay complex on the night moons of the Kimara system in one stroke. The Howling Griffins Chapter forces garrisoning the Kimara system were outnumbered and overwhelmed, suffering greatly as their bastions and stations fell one after the other despite their tenacious defense. The Howling Griffins were systematically destroyed by the relentless onslaught of the Executioners from an unseen quarter. As the Howling Griffins' positions were being overrun and decimated, on the airless dust moon, it fell to the dreadnought confessor, Armand Titus, to rally the beleaguered forces of his chapter. Unafraid of the firestorm around him, with impeccable zeal, the venerable chaplain dreadnought led the desperate counterattack which bought his chapter the chance to regroup and mount an effective fighting defense at the cost of his long life. After the Executioners had finally withdrawn from the battlefield, the surviving Howling Griffins found that their foe had honored Titus's glorious sacrifice by laying out the wreck of his sarcophagus with a ring of broken weapons, placing one of their own shattered standards in the lifeless grasp of the fallen war machine. The death of the revered dreadnought confessor Titus struck a hammer blow to the Howling Griffin's morale. With the Kimara system's defense platforms and listening stations destroyed, the Executioners had achieved their primary objective. They could have pressed their advantage and utterly destroyed the Howling Griffin's outpost, but instead withdrew suddenly from the system, leaving the Howling Griffin's garrison with more than 70% casualties. This development provoked much consternation from Huron. But mindful of the dangerous temperament of the executioner's commander, the High Chaplain Tusula Kane, he was known to have stopped short of issuing any formal reprimand to them, and instead welcomed them into the battle for the successionist cause. Despite the grievous losses dealt to them, the remainder of the Howling Griffin's task force continued to doggedly fight on, refusing to shrink away from the responsibilities to the Loyalist cause until formally relieved from the war in 909. Enemies unlooked for. Oh, you're gonna like this one. Taking advantage of the anarchy that reigned within the Maelstrom Zone, it was unsurprising that attacks from unaligned raiding forces and Xenos species based within the turbulence expanse of the Maelstrom dramatically increased, reaching a new height during the 907th year. The Successionists suffered the worst at the hands of these non-aligned forces during the Badab War. A large Orc corsair fleet spilled forth from the Kalak system, assaulting Successionist supply convoys between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector, and ultimately assaulted the Mantis warriors at Endymion itself. A large force of over 20,000 green-skinned boys proceeded to slaughter the planet's meager garrison, forcing the Mantis warriors' forces to pull back to defend Endymion and meet the Orcs in a rapid-moving land battle on the dust plains of Orella, lest they would lose the world. As serious as the Orc attack against the cluster was, there was a far worse implication of the growing threat of the demon-tainted Corsair cults based on the blighted world of Magog. Their increase in power had actually reinforced the recently defeated Orcs. This forced the Successionists to launch a direct assault on the hellish world, which despite the prior Exterminatus campaign had long remained a thorn in the Maelstrom Warder's side. Koirin Sumatris, one of Huron's most seasoned battle captains, commanded an Astral Claws battle barrage and conducted the attack on Magog. A force of 2 companies of the chapter and a strong force of hand-picked Astral Claws and Lamenter's Terminators successfully cut off the threat while it was still forming. The Tyrant of Badab knew well they could ill afford the risk of fighting a war on 2 fronts if they continued to allow the dire threat on Magog to continue to grow. Though a costly diversion that caused a high number of fatalities, the Successionists were able to reinforce their flank just as a new enemy entered the conflict. And this one's going to be the worst one of them all. Wrath of the Minotaurs. The powerful fleet-based chapter of dark renown, the Minotaurs arrived in full strength in the Maelstrom Zone in mid-907. They announced their presence in the war by launching a full chapter-scale assault on the Successionist-controlled mining facility on Cairo, wiping out 46,000-strong Tyrant's Legion garrison and rendering the mineworks unusable. Afterwards, the Minotaur sent a starship with representatives and officially presented themselves to the Loyalist Council of War. Their master, the darkly famed Asterion Moloch, remained with his chapter to raid through the Pale Stars region in order to decimate rather than conquer a pre-planned list of resource production within the region in order to starve the Successionist war effort. While the Minotaur's chapter ceded overall strategic authority to the War Council of the Loyalist chapters already engaged in the conflict, they deliberately stayed largely aloof and distant from its general chain of command, distancing themselves from the other chapters, as was their wont, and deferring to the Legate Inquisitor's authority more often than that of the Lord High Commander Caraban Colin or his advisors. This distance was shown in their standing representative to the War Council, the gaunt, brooding, and taciturn chaplain Ivanus Enkomi, whose red-rimmed eyes observed all, although he barely spoke a word during the gatherings. The Minotaur's chapter master, Asterion Moloch, never put in a personal appearance at these councils, and the only evidence that he served during the Badab conflict at all came from picked footage recovered from battle scans and fearful stories spread by the few Successionist survivors of the Minotaur's brutal attacks. The Minotaurs had come in answer to the direct summons from the acting legate inquisitor for more space marines to join the loyalist cause against the secessionist chapters. Though the arrival of their savage chapter was cautiously welcomed by the loyalists, they undoubtedly couldn't deny the considerable strength that would be added to the Imperium's cause. The conflict was in its fourth standard year of open warfare, and the Minotaurs committed their strength to the war. 10 companies and 11 capital ships of various types. While the chapter coordinated their efforts with the Loyalist command, they operated largely independent throughout the conflict, striking targets as they saw fit. The Minotaurs attacked indiscriminately, assaulting not only the 30-plus secessionist-controlled minor worlds and the void stations, but also overlooked independent minor outposts, operating largely independently in the southern Maelstrom Zone. The Minotaurs proceeded to strike targets amidst the pale stars and Dini stellar drift border regions. The viciousness of the chapter's reputation for leaving no survivors among those that resisted them quickly grew and remained uncontested until the arrival of the even more savage Carcadon's chapter. Only the warships and strike forces of the executioners seemed able to halt the Minotaur's progress within the region, the two chapters seemingly relishing the battle between them as a kind of bloody sport. For the remainder of the year, the Minotaurs gained several important victories for the Loyalist cause, destroying the Tyrant's Legion force on Crow's World and Larsa, and forced the Astral Claws to withdraw or risk having their worlds isolated and ravaged one by one. Within 1/3 of a standard year of the Minotaur's arrival in the region, the direct and collateral damage caused by their forces reduced the human population of the Pale Stars alone by more than 20%. The power of this chapter quickly proved a decisive weight in the Loyalist's favor, regardless of his brutal methods. By the end of 907, the secessionist forces had begun to be pushed back from several key star systems and suffered severe losses in the north and central Maelstrom Zone. The battle for Galen between the Astral Claws and a joint force of salamanders and fire angels eventually resulted in the Loyalists successfully taking the system. To further add to the secessionists' dreadful losses was the loss of the world of Vinaya, which finally fell after a massive joint assault by the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions chapters. Huron had all but abandoned the world, and the sizable Tyrant's Legion garrison stationed there to their fate. As the Angels of Death fell amongst the beleaguered defenders, their end was swift and brutal. And by dawn, Vinaya was in Loyalist hands, as the Tyrant's Legion was put to the sword. Scourging of Syngax. In the early 908, yes, we're getting there, inquisitorial agents had acquired evidence of a plot between the Astral Claws and renegade heretic scavengers from the Golgothan Waste. They had devised a plan to acquire recovered buried weapon stores on the dead world of Syngax. The Sons of Medusa task force, backed by a newly arrived company from the Exorcist chapter, were given this task. Given the chief role in this task, the Sons of Medusa led a determined and brutal campaign to scour out the Tyrant of Badab's forces, the conduct of which caused some discord between the two chapters, with accusations that the Sons of Medusa were more interested in pursuing their own mysterious agenda instead of hunting down the enemy as expeditiously as possible. The Exorcists soon withdrew and redeployed their forces for the forthcoming assault on the Sagan system, leaving the Sons of Medusa to eliminate the Syngax threat as they saw fit. The Second Battle of Sagan. The Second Battle of Sagan was a major planetary assault undertaken in 908 that drove the secessionists from their fortresses in the Sagan subsector. The assault was carried out by the largest combined loyalist force fielded to that point during the Badab War. This offensive utilized the mass strength of the Fire Angels, Red Scorpions, and Exorcist chapters, supported by assault specialized forces drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Nova Marines. The Successionists chose to mount a defense at any cost rather than giving up the strategically vital Sagan system. I'm thinking about Yu-Gi-Oh! For a reason. The fighting proved to be bloody and costly in the extreme. In a desperate attempt to either drive the Loyalists from the surface of Sagan 3 or render the planet unusable to them, the Astral Claws resorted to the use of viral weapons that slew tens of thousands of the world's population. This use of weapons of mass destruction ultimately destroyed a sizable component of the Secessionists' own battle line. The Fire Angels deployed their full chapter strength and bore the brunt of the Loyalist casualties valiantly, sacrificing themselves in order to contain the Astral Claws' desperate final attempts to drive their foes from the world through the utilization of suicide attacks. This campaign resulted in the highest death toll of any single engagement of the war to this point in the conflict, as well as the loss of several key Successionist warships in a vain counterattack on the system. The successful Loyalist invasion of the Sagan system proved to be a major turning point of the war. After the system fell under Loyalist control, it became the primary Imperial base in the Maelstrom Zone, affording the Loyalists offensive greater access to the primary stable warp routes into the region while denying those routes to the enemy. Shortly after the end of the campaign, Sagan 3 was used as a supply point in order to fully relieve and reinforce the world of Cerngard and support the start of the Endymion suppression campaign. This Loyalist advance effectively forced the remaining Mantis Warriors forces into a purely defensive posture, isolating them from the Badab sector and their Secessionist allies. After the Second Battle of Sagan, the Maelstrom Zone was effectively split into two regions, the Endymion cluster and the still heavily defended Badab sector itself. From this point onwards in the conflict, the Successionists were only able to conduct commerce raids and targeted strikes, which were carried out by the vessels of the Executioners and Lamenters chapter fleets. Beyond the difficulties possessed to the Imperium by the ongoing Badab War, the safety of the Ultima Segmentum was also threatened at this time by massive orc incursions after multiple wars erupted across the eastern fringe of the galaxy. With the Successionists having been judged sufficiently contained after the victory at Sagan 3, the Loyalists redeployed the chapters that had suffered battlefield attrition to some degree to deal with the green screen threat. The redeployment included the forces of the Nova Marines, Raptors, and Howling Griffins chapter. They were withdrawn one by one from the conflict in managed stages as part of a major Imperium-wide strategic redeployment, along with a number of warships of the Imperial Navy's Segmentum Solar reserve forces, which had been deployed in support of the Loyalist cause. We're getting to the sad one now. Destruction of the Lamenters. Inquisitor Legate Jardice Frayne provided the Loyalists with a mass of data about the Lamenters' movements and deployments, which was used to identify a pattern. By 908, the Lamenters chapter had already suffered significant losses through attrition, but they were still a formidable force to be reckoned with, and the plan was put into action to isolate them from the Tyrant's cause and take them out of the war. Using the intelligence acquired by Frayne's insidious spy network, the Loyalists quickly discerned that the Lamenters were being used as an ablative shield by the Tyrant of Badab to guard his southern flank and contest the Loyalist domination of the Pale Stars, while he kept the bulk of the Astral Claws in reserve near Badab itself. The loss incurred by the fleet-based chapter had been due to their continuous deployment defending the southern Badab sector, as well as serving escort duty to many Successionist supply convoys. The Minotaur's chapter gathered in strength, awaiting the opportunity to strike where they would be most effective, until finally the opportunity came, when the location of the Lamenter's chapter broke, Mater Lacrimarum, was discovered in orbit over the feral world of Optera taking on supplies. I like that name, Mater Lacrimarum. Well, anyway, continuing the story. The Minotaurs immediately dispatched a rapid strike force to attack the vessel and succeed in catching it and crippling its main drives, preventing it from fleeing the system. The Lamentors were forced to defend their chapter Baroque at all costs, as it contained both their recovering battle casualties as well as their precious resource of gene seed. With the continued attacks upon the Baroque, the majority of the Lamentors' fleet was drawn back to the Optera system. Once there, the Minotaurs laid bloody siege for 17 solar hours of brutal ship-to-ship fighting. Though the Minotaurs suffered heavy casualties, they eventually overpowered the Lamentors by virtue of their brutality and sheer weight of numbers. Their forces shattered. The few remaining Lamentors were forced to surrender rather than risk the annihilation of their precious Baroque. The majority of their fleet was left unruined or drifting in the void. The Minotaurs claimed salvage rights to the crippled Lamentors' fleet and the war gear of the fallen to replace their own serious losses. The surviving Lamentors were incarcerated on a prison hulk orbiting the night side of Sagan II, amid rumors of their growing insanity and confinement. Only 311 Lamentors' battle brothers survived to be interned on the prison hulk orbiting Sagan II for the rest of the war. Less than 100, estimated of course, Lamentors were deployed elsewhere during the fighting that still remained. The chapter's severe losses effectively removed them from the Successionists' order of battle. The loss of the Lamentors from the Successionist cause was a great strength they could ill afford to lose. Angstrom Incident. Wait, it's not I don't think it's Maelstrom, I think it's Maelstrom. But I think Maelstrom sounds better. Anyway, the Maelstrom Incident. The Loyalists intervened in matters unfolding on the world of Angstrom in 908, in what would become one of the most remarkable operations of the Badab War. The sovereign and autonomous Adeptus Mechanicus domain of Angstrom in the eastern Maelstrom Zone had remained neutral throughout the conflict, rejecting diplomatic missions and threats from both sides to join them in their cause. The world's Magi felt that there was no cause for them to interfere in what they perceived as an internal dispute between rival Imperial factions. Angstrom continued their operations as usual, which included a long-standing agreement to render up bounty of advanced weapons and refined ores to be collected by the Imperium's representatives on a 3-year cycle from the edge of their planetary system. The Magi pointedly didn't care from which of the Imperium servants retrieved the bounty, only that they carried out their part of the arrangement without fault. In the past, this arrangement had provided the Maelstrom warders with vital resources, and the Tyrant of Badab's servants continued to be in the perfect position to collect it. The Red Scorpions and Salamanders jointly conducted a secret plan of attack, deploying a small elite force to sabotage and prevent the Successionists from claiming the bounty of the independent forge world of Angstrom. And the confusion and destruction that followed, the Angstrom Mechanicus, incensed by the outbreak of hostilities within their domain, assaulted both sides and drove them away from the system, granting the Loyalists a major strategic victory. But did, however, steer the notorious Bellicose Mechanicus of Angstrom into taking a greater interest in the war. They sent their warships and ground forces in retaliatory raids against Galan and Ibis, until the Terran legate intervened and brokered a peace, guaranteeing the fickle Angstrom Mechanicus restitution. Remaining cautious, Lord High Commander Karba Colin took precautionary measures and dispatched the Firehawks chapter and the Raptorus Rex alongside the pursuit force, composed of a mixture of loyalist chapters, to conduct a blockade on the outer system's approach for the duration of the war. Loyalist domination. 909. By 909 of the 31st millennium, of course, the Imperial Loyalists had effective command on the Maelstrom Zone's major warp routes, enabling them to rapidly move their forces across the region and subjugate many rebel worlds and outposts. The Angstrom incident's aftermath effectively cut the Tyrant of Badab's sphere of influence in half and contained the succession, dividing the successionists between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector itself. Only the unpredictable forces of the Executioner's chapter offered a significant threat to the Loyalist control outside the secessionist enclaves. From this point onwards, the secessionists, greatly reduced in fighting strength and warships, were effectively hemmed in around a handful of heavily defended star clusters and relegated to conducting scattered raiding operations and fighting a series of close defensive sieges. By the end of 909, whispers had reached Imperial intelligence operatives of the tyrant's increasing violence and paranoia, and of the further tightening of his murderous stranglehold on those worlds he still controlled. The Mantis warriors were reduced to fighting a guerrilla resistance against an ongoing loyalist suppression campaign, comprising combined elements from the Fire Angels and the Sons of Medusa chapters. Sporadic and oft-times bloody engagements were also fought in the Tranquility, Iblis, and Sigurd systems. The Loyalist forces suffered a severe defeat when the Fire Angel strike cruiser, Polaris Rising, was raided by the Mantis warriors under the leadership of their prophetic Master Librarian, Ahazara Redth. That's a weird name, but it's bound to happen in the 40k universe. They succeeded in damaging their main plasma reactors and weapon bays before withdrawing their forces, leaving them at the mercy of 2 Orc Killa cruisers. The Fire Angels fought a resolute last stand against the vile Greenskins, disabling one of the Killa cruisers before they were boarded by the remaining Orc vessel. As the Orcs swarmed the decks of the Fire Angels vessel, and the Mantis warriors fell in ambush upon the badly mauled Orc forces from their flank and annihilated them. The remaining 37 surviving Fire Angels were marooned to Sigurd VI under the care of their surviving apothecary and his servitors, while their battered vessel was taken by the Mantis warriors as their prize. The barbarous Executioner's chapter continued to prove to be the scourge of Loyalist patrols and supply convoys, as well as destroying numerous outposts and listening stations. Some 43 merchant men. Why is it spelled together? Whatever. Some 43 merchantmen and 11 warships have been either seized or destroyed. They also committed themselves to several heavy raids as far as Bellerophon's Fall and Cairo. Their heaviest action fell against the savage Minotaur's chapter in the southern Maelstrom Zone, such as the bloody tank duel fought on the airless moon of Uzel, and the Crow World system. The location of the Executioner's base of operations continued to elude the Loyalists, allowing the Executioners to raid them almost at will, giving battle against Red Scorpions and Minotaur chapters, harrying Loyalist shipping and steaming attempts to consolidate Loyalist gains. At the close of 909, of course, of the 31st millennium, the Maelstrom succession had largely been contained, but the war itself was far from over. The Loyalists knew that the next phase of the campaign would be particularly brutal. It would be a time of ruthless planetary purges, scorched earth campaigns, not tactics, and apocalyptic sieges. The Loyalists needed time to prepare for such a campaign, and fresh reinforcements if a victory was to be swiftly achieved. But Lord High Commander Caravan Cole, the Magister Militum of the Adeptus Astartes forces, and his advisors knew they could not afford to wait too long before they went on the offensive, for every day gave the secessionists further opportunity to entrench and perhaps make good their own losses. Cullen knew he simply could not afford to allow a general of Huron's caliber too long to rebuild, plan, and prepare. Subjugation of Galan. The beginning of the year 910, of the 31st millennium, of course, proved to be a final deathly calm before the oncoming storm, which would inevitably see the Badab War brought to its terrible conclusion. Many of the chapters on the Loyalist side had suffered substantial losses, and now would be replaced by other Space Marine chapters of even darker renown. The Maelstrom Zone would soon be visited by slaughter, unlike anything it had known in its long and turbulent history. For 6 long standard years, the isolated Galan system had been a prize that had been battled over repeatedly, changing hands between Loyalist and Successionist forces several times. Most significantly, the Galan system had been the site of major battles between the Firehawks chapter and the mixed Successionist assault force, which had incurred heavy losses on both sides. A battle which had seen Galan 2's or Galan 2's life-supporting domes laid waste, leading to mass refugee immigration to its neighbor, the frontier world of Galan 6. Under the direct command of the Magister Militum Caravan Khan, the Loyalist forces diverted to impose order on Galan 6, crushing any hope of future resistance utterly. Accompanied by an Ordo Hereticus detachment under Inquisitor Cramner, one of Inquisitor Legate Jarndyce Freyne's personal aides, the only stipulation was that the planet was to remain habitable within a sufficient core of the population and infrastructure left alive and intact to service the needs of the Imperium's war effort. Plans to retake the world were calculated accordingly, under the direction of the Sons of Medusa's chapters, Irontain Vailud Kal, the theater commander. The Sons of Medusa launched an orbital bombardment of predetermined landing zones on the outskirts of the old city. They then claimed 3 company-strength landing zones on the edge of Galan 6's old city, encircling it and destroying all resistance. Over the course of 3 solar days and nights, the industrious Sons of Medusa landed supplies in additional Astartes and began the task of fabricating new fortifications and bastions. On the dawning of the 4th day, an unnatural fear and dread had descended upon the several million surviving inhabitants. This fear was a calculated weapon of the often employed by the Sons of Medusa. Without warning, the chapter launched a large armored assault composed of rhinos, razorbacks, land raiders, and hulking dreadnoughts, while land speeders took to the skies. Alongside the green livery of the emerald armored specters of death was the crimson colors of the Inquisition's chimeras and repressors. From their vehicles' laud hailers, the Inquisition demanded the surrender of all of Galan 6's population for immediate judgment. Some of the population hurled themselves suicidally at the embodiment of the Emperor's wrath, only to be ruthlessly cut down by the Sons of Medusa, while others cowered in their hastily prepared defensive positions or attempted to flee the city. Those that attempted to do so were ruthlessly cut down by the patrolling land speeders and vulture gunships. Those that offered serious resistance within the city were isolated and destroyed. Only those that offered no resistance were spared, ignored by the Sons of Medusa as they had been so ordered. These survivors wept openly, joyful only to be taken by the Inquisition's troops for processing and judgment on the Holy Ordos' assize bastions located in the Imperial landing zones. The old city was firmly in the hands of the Imperials within 76 solar hours of the commencement of the Sons of Medusa's attack. News of the massacre soon spread across Galan 6, and the shroud of terror descended upon the planet. Before long, millions of natives and refugees alike surrendered, even though to do so was believed to be a death sentence at the hands of the Inquisition, rather than live in fear of what was to come. The ruins of the old city were repurposed and rebuilt as an interment and processing center to handle Galen 6's population. Overall, the Galen campaign was considered a success, although much of the population of Old City had been slain. The total death toll was considered light compared to that of a lengthy, planet-wide campaign of attrition. Amazingly, the Ordo Hereticus was merciful, indentering the majority of the planet's population into a lifetime of penal servitude to pay for their crimes and transgressions against the Emperor. As a result, the Departamento Munitorum raised a number of fresh penile legions from the most hardened elements found on the world, while the rest of the population was set to toil on Galen 6 itself or be deported elsewhere within the Maelstrom Zone to aid the rebuilding effort. The Sons of Medusa departing Galen 6 shortly thereafter, leaving the planet as a veritable prison world whose population would pay for their crimes against the Imperium for generations. Are you ready for this one? Blood in the Dark Waters, 910. Arriving without warning in 910, an unidentified, fire-blackened Space Marine strike cruiser identified itself with an ancient, though still valid, Imperial authorization protocols. It was the Levitus Vex, and its coming heralded the arrival of a force whose name was to become synonymous with bloodshed and the darkest acts of the Badab War. The unified Space Marine force had come to offer its aid to the Loyalist cause against the Secessionists, claiming to have come in answer to a summon from Terra itself. They identified their chapter as the Carcadons Astar, using the ancient High Gothic form of their name, also known as the Carcadons, or the Space Sharks, in Low Gothic, and formally requested the Loyalist acceptance and permission to enter the war zone and draw blood. Upon their arrival, the Carcadons, force commander Tiberius, presented the Inquisitor Legate in charge of prosecuting the Badab conflict with notices patent provided to the chapter, affirming the rights and titles issued to it by several High Lords of Terra and Inquisitors now long dead. Tiberius even submitted himself for psychic probing and gene sampling. The Inquisitor Legate vouched for the Carcadons. Lord High Commander Karab Colin of the Red Scorpions, the Magister Militant or Supreme Commander of all Loyalist forces, accepted the Carcadons into his lines of battle, although he was still wary of their loyalties and their deviations from the Codex Astartes during their long voyage beyond the Imperial space. The Carcadons' reappearance as if predators drawn by blood when the Badab War was to enter its most deadly stage seemed to many a suspect one at best. The Tranquility Campaign, 910. By 910, the strength of the Mantis Warriors had been greatly diminished, but Karab Kolun recognized the folly of leaving them undefeated at his flank as the Loyalists turned their force to the invasion of the Badab sector. The Adeptus Astartes Magister Militum had already considered a change in his deployment in order to mount a renewed offensive against the Endymion cluster. But with the arrival of the Carcadons, the Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions had been offered an unexpected asset to deploy. And so, he let loose their savage ferocity against the Mantis warriors and the unsuspecting worlds of their domain. The fleet of the Carcadons broke out of warp directly above the Sigard system, on the galactic plane, perilously close to Sigard's swollen and violent sun, masking their presence with its solar flares. Split up in dozens of strike forces, the grey-clad Space Marines led the Sigard system have the first taste of their wrath and fury as they proceeded to devastate the numerous belt colonies, ship clans, and asteroid citadels. The Carcadons proceeded to devastate the entirety of the system, destroying in mere solar days and weeks had taken millennia to build and had withstood the ravages of Xenos and Corsairs alike. In the aftermath of this brutal campaign, an Imperial naval scout vessel reported the entire system littered with wreckage, their Vox channels full of discordant, ghostly Vox signals of dead and dying ships. It was also noted that the Carcadons had deliberately plundered and scavenged, both in terms of gear, resource, and indeed human life. It had been the conclusion of several authorities since that the choice of Sigard, with its wealth of void colonies and infrastructure, had been the Carcadons' first target, not simply because it had long connections with the Mantis warriors, but because the Carcadons' unknown voyage from the outer darkness they had need of its bounty to replenish themselves in readiness for their part in the war. The Carcadons continued to systematically annihilate planets in the cluster known to have harbored the Mantis warriors, forcing the Successionist Chapter to stop using their hidden run tactics against the Loyalists and mass their forces in defense of these worlds. The strategy spared the Carcadons from having to pursue them across the Endymion cluster to places where their foes held the advantage of support and local knowledge. First, the Carcadons ravaged the feudal world of Iblis, smashing its infrastructure and putting its ruler to the sword. Then, they attacked the planet's scattered settlements and nomadic crawler caravans by night, leaving bloody wreckage in their wake. They proceeded to turn Iblis into a wasteland inhabited only by shell-shocked survivors. The savage chapter then moved on and attacked the blighted industrial world of Endymion Prime itself, where a small Fire Angels force already held command of a decrepit Manufactoria complex against Mantis warriors-led insurgents. The Carcadons launched an orbital assault, oblivious to the Fire Angels' disposition, into the contested battle. Hundreds of great drop pods dropping to the soot-caked planet amid a great slaughter. Honor-bound to defend this world, the Mantis warriors were forced to respond, coming to Endymion Prime's aid with increasing numbers of their chapter to curb the savagery of the Carcadons' assault. Though the Mantis warriors matched the Carcadons with their own fierce and martial skill, they were too few and could not turn the tide of the assault. Led by their chief librarian Ahazra Redis, the Mantis warriors refused to retreat and died in defense of the planet, just as the Carcadons' leader Tiberos had predicted. The Carcadons continued to employ this pattern on the worlds of Castal and Largitor, and then the twin inhabited worlds of the Tranquility system themselves. Each battle forced the Mantis warriors to come to the aid of the beleaguered worlds, destroying the Mantis warriors' ability to effect the war. Now, worn down and scattered, the chapter had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, but at a great price. In the aftermath of the Tranquility campaign, the Fire Angels, having suffered heavy casualties, sought permission to withdraw from the conflict. This was in no small part due to the increasing anger of the Fire Angels against the Carcadons, with whom they had repeatedly been at odds during the Tranquility campaign, and whose savage methods they held in utter contempt. Appalled by the actions of their allies, the Fire Angels withdrew their remaining contingents from the war with honor and returned to their homeworld to rebuild their sorely damaged chapter. With the threat of the Endymion cluster neutralized, the Carcadons redeployed, splitting their fleets to patrol the Loyalists' rear echelons and relive the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions to consolidate ahead of the expected invasion of the Badab sector. Unfortunately for the ravaged people of the Endymion cluster, this would not be the only time calamity was visited upon their worlds, for the Carcadons would yet return in later years to enact a final act of savagery against them. Corsian Massacre. This is considered by some a lost tale. And it's a lost tale of the Badab War, whose true facts will never be known. The event that became known in Imperial records as the Corsian Massacre was discovered by an Imperial Navy patrol in 910, The wreckage of a smuggler's base was discovered in the dust waste of the forlorn world of Corsia II. Within the base was a nightmarish scene of carnage and destruction, rarely witnessed before by men. Bloody battle had been fought between two sub-company-sized forces of space marines from the Executioners and the Carcadons chapters. These two chapters, both infamous for their savagery and unyielding stances toward their foes, had fought each other to mutual annihilation. The base around them was ripped apart, its former inhabitants now moldering into dust. Many of the bodies of both sides showed signs of having fought on despite suffering horrendous wounds, severed limbs, and massive trauma that would have felled even an Astartes. And several were found locked in deathly gore-splattered embraces, striking at their foes with their last ebbing strength. It is not known which chapter last warrior survived to the end to claim a bitter victory. Neither chapter has acknowledged any survivors of the massacre living to tell of what happened at Corsia II. Clash of Iron and Fire, 910. In mid-910, there was an increase in Corsair activity along the eastern Maelstrom Zone. Among those in the Loyalist High Command, this was believed to have been caused by at least one Astral Claws task force that had somehow slipped out of the Badab sector itself and was now operating from the edges of the Maelstrom. Imperial Navy escorts, search and destroy squadrons were dispatched to the area to quell these attacks so that the Successionists would not be able to exploit the opportunity to start a new battlefront on the Loyalist flank. Upon the frontier world of Rook, they found their evidence. This was one of the few worlds within the Maelstrom that could be relied upon to willingly aid Imperial agents, as their population was made up of obolitionist zealots. They informed the Loyalist command that there had indeed been an increase in slave raids of nearby systems of human corsair ships led by an Astral Claw strike cruiser, identified as the Hikrania. The pattern of attacks by these corsair ships was tracked by the echo left in the warp to the Lamptan system and its twin feral worlds of Shaprias and Scarfell. Having divined that a strong enemy force was massing at this location, the Imperial Navy squadron was forced to withdraw in order to refit and resupply, returning to seek reinforcements. Elsewhere in the northern Maelstrom Zone, the Carcadons were busy carrying out the final stages of the Tranquility campaign, while in the southern zone, the Minotaurs and Sons of Medusa, backed by Astra Militarum Pino regiments, were assaulting Isin on the edge of the Badab sector itself, where the Tyrant's Legion was putting up a tenacious defense. Lord High Commander Calab Cullen marched his own Red Scorpions chapter and the newly reinforced Exorcist chapter contingent at Sagan in preparation for an assault on the strategic warp terminus of Piraeus. This was a vital target and considered by many to be the gateway to the Badab sector. Overall, the Loyalist forces had suffered considerable losses since the start of the war, and the contingents of many of the Space Marine chapters, which had previously fought for the Loyalists' cause, had now departed. Some, such as the Howling Griffins and Marines Errant, had withdrawn owing to the casualties they had suffered, while others, such as the Nova Marines and the most recently Fire Angels, had departed for reasons of their own. In short, Loyalist forces were stretched thin, despite the fresher Space Marine companies that had recently arrived, and Cullen could not afford to be drawn into fighting on an increasing number of fronts to be bled dry slowly by attrition, as no doubt was the Tyrant of Badab's plan. Taking counsel with his fellow Space Marine commanders, it was the leader of the Salamander's contingent, the old and famed warrior Pelas Mirsan, who offered a solution to the events of Lapton. offering to lead his own forces in a lightning strike against Laptan. The salamanders would rely on the element of surprise, the arcane skills of Ona Nostroma, to position their attack, and the power of their potent battle barge, Pyre of Glory, dealing a crippling blow to the enemy. Chaplain Ivanus Enkomi, representing the aloof and secretive Minotaurs chapter in the War Council, offered to take his personal guard and such forces as he could muster to aid the salamanders in this mission. So, approved, the strike force named the Gift of Fire was further augmented by a pair of Imperial Navy light cruisers and a frigate squadron. This force was dispatched immediately on the long voyage to the Laptan system. They were to meet the foe in battle. Castigation of Chaprias. When the Loyalists entered the erratic binary star system of Laptan, their fears were soon realized. Above the feral world of Chaprias and a ragged armada of star vessels, scows, and wrecks had been assembled from scavenged hulks and pirated freight, while OPEX scans and auger probes revealed that on the planet below, vast camps and training grounds had been raised up. Here on Chaprias, a new army was being forged from brutal and tainted tribal warriors enslaved to the Tyrant of Badab's cause, a disposable weapon to kill and be killed at Huron's will. Mirsan deduced that the bulk of the enemy warships were away on some mission of plunder. There would not be a better time to strike. Swiftly, the venerable Salamander's commander configured a bold attack plan. The joint Astartes strike force made planetfall and immediately attacked the secessionist bastions and training camps. In the meantime, their ships and naval escort immediately swept out again and set about destroying the armada as swiftly as thoroughly as possible. When the two chapters launched their drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships, they divided their chosen killing grounds. Though they met with a firmer resistance than their salamander cousins, the Minotaurs were masters of siegecraft as they attacked the iron-shod bastions of the Astral Claws. Using their Thunderhawks to punch a gap in the enemy's firing lines, the gunship disgorged assault terminators and devastator squads directly into the smoking wreckage. The rest of the company's strong Minotaurs force deployed directly behind this breaking point, suffering the brunt of the enemy's counterattack. Despite heavy casualties, the Minotaurs' vanguard veterans held the ruined bastion with disciplined ferocity, not giving an inch of ground to the oncoming secessionists. The bronze-armored Minotaurs clashed in brutal close combat with the Astral Claws retaliators, who advanced under cover of their combat shields, through a hail of bolter fire to try to retake the sundered fortifications, only to be hurled back time and again from the mount of a twisted metal and shattered rockcrity. I don't know what that is. Although in numbers, the Minotaurs and the defending Astral Claws at the bastion line were roughly equal, the enemy was well entrenched and well armed and well led, lacking nothing for bravery and fighting spirit. But the Minotaurs were masters of siegecraft, and this blood-soaked close-quarter hell was exactly the kind of battlefield in which they revealed. Led by an armored spearhead of land raiders and siege dreadnoughts, the Astral Claws were pinned in place by the Minotaur's second attack line. Chaplain Enkomi personally led a jump-pack equipped vanguard veteran squad in storming the secondary enemy bastion and slaying all within. Encircled and cut off, the Astral Claws were swiftly isolated and destroyed in detail. Though their progress was slow and bloody, the secessionists could not stem the loyalist advance. The Astral Claws made them pay a price in dead for every fortification the Minotaurs took. But inevitably, the bastions fell one by one, and victory was acclaimed by the Minotaurs. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Salamander's force descended on the heart of the city-sized training camps. A secondary force composed of a chosen wing of Caestus assault rams, carrying aboard them a force of salamanders, fire drakes, terminators, the greatest warriors of their esteemed chapter, took on the task of attacking the secessionists' landing grounds. On their first pass, the armored prows and magna meltas of the Caestus savaged the enemy transport craft caught on the ground, sundering and burning through their hulls, rupturing their fuel tanks. The fire drakes, assaulting from their craft into the billowing black palls of smoke, turned confusion and destruction into a massacre, their storm bolters and cyclone missile launchers sweeping the panicked foe away before any resistance could be organized. Elsewhere, the main Salamander's force, led by Captain Mirsan, had descended into the heart of the enemy, deploying their troops and armor into a defensive ring at the center of the training camps. Utterly surrounded, the Salamander's force at under 100 Space Marines was outnumbered more than 1,000 to 1 by the horde of savages and mutants, the brutal inhabitants of a dozen nearby worlds that rose up before them. Though their position would have been considered a suicidal one by any other warriors, these were the scions of Vulcan, and they cared little for such odds. The great horde, which was leaderless and staggered by the sudden fury and shock of the Salamander's assault, were slow to react, and by the time they pressed the attack, they were met by a wall of firepower. Thousands of heretics fell within the opening minutes of the battle as whirlwind launchers, predator destructors, and the ordered ranks of the Salamanders let loose with a salvo at almost point-blank range. Soon the broken ground of the training fields was covered with mounds of twitching bodies. The horde only rallied when their taskmasters took the field behind them, the blood-stained steel-colored power armor of Astral Claws. The Salamanders marked their true foe in the form of retaliator squads amidst the filthy rabble of the heretic horde, keeping up their relentless tide of fire. Mirsan sprang the second phase of his assault plan into action, as three prize Land Raider Achilles spearheaded a counter-assault aimed directly at the Astral Claws contingent. The tanks fired their Thunderfire cannons, and multiple meltas blasting a swath through the ranks of the horde. As the Land Raiders plowed through the center of the Astral Claws force, they swung aside as the fury of the Ancients was unleashed. 6 dreadnoughts, led by the darkly famed Briart Ashmantle, the Iron Dragon, stormed into Astral Claws' lines, smashing them asunder and drenching them with purifying flame. Overmatched and overwhelmed, the Astral Claws did not yield lightly, but were slain in glorious combat, felling 2 of the Salamander's Ancients. As the last Astral Claws died, the name of the Tyrant of Badab was hallowed with their centurion's dying breath as the Iron Dragon tore him in half and cast his carcass to the winds. With their master slaughtered, the horde panicked and broke, the tens of thousands that remained alive fleeing in a mindless stampede away from the lords of fire and death at their backs, crushing and killing hundreds more of their own numbers in the rout. Deep beneath the smashed fortification, the Minotaurs and the Salamanders soon discovered what secrets they were built to defend. A vast natural cavern system housing heretic laboratories. These had been manufacturing combat drugs in vast quantities and attempting primitive gene tampering and experimental surgery on the feral warriors of Shaprias, along with hundreds of Imperial prisoners taken in the raids across the eastern Maelstrom Zone. At the lowest levels, guarded by a cadre of the hated corpse taker apothecaries of the Tyrant's Legion and their servitors was an armored vault within which was a store of Space Marine gene seed, in part stolen from loyalists fallen in battle. The conflict in orbit had also gone in the loyalists' favor, while the battle raged below, but not without a cost. While the makeshift armada had been blasted to scrap and burning debris, concealed weapons platforms set to guard the fleet had inflicted damage to the Pyre of Glory, and gutted the sword-class frigate Epona, which had been abandoned as a burning hulk. Less than 11 solar days after the battle was first joined, the Gift of Fire task force departed the Laptan system to undertake the perilous voyage back to Loyalist-held space. With over 1,000 free prisoners carried in the holds of its naval light cruisers, and the priceless recovered gene seed held in the inner sanctum of the Pyre of Glory itself, the Gift of Fire had claimed a great victory for the Loyalists and uncovered unthwarted a dark machination of the Tyrants that it felt to hatch could have... Wait, I have to redo this. The Gift of Fire had claimed a great victory for the Loyalists and uncovered and thwarted a dark machination of the Tyrants that if left to hatch could have had dire consequences for the Imperium. Little did any in the Loyalist high command suspect, however, that the attack at Laptan would have immediate and unforeseen consequences that would unexpectedly alter the course of the Badab War. The Red Hour. The Gift of Fire task force was unexpectedly struck by a powerful warp squall and scattered en route back to Imperial-controlled space. Calamity was averted by the formidable skill of their lead navigator, and only a single frigate was lost to the Imperium, while the Salamander's battle barge, Pyre of Glory, and the light cruiser, Admiral Gregorius, were turned back into the Maelstrom, riding ahead of the Stormfront, and forced to ford into real space, and the relative stability of the Kallax Shohaus within the Maelstrom's boundary to repair and refit. The Loyalists' arrival had not gone unnoticed, for soon news of their presence was carried to the Successionists. The Astral Claws strike cruiser Hyrcania was still in the region, having found its home base on Chaprias destroyed. Its master, Arch-Centurion Karnak Commodus, craved vengeance and atonement for his fallings in the eyes of his lord, but Commodus knew that alone his vessel stood little chance on taking on the wounded Loyalists. He sent an encrypted astropathic message seeking aid. Seeking aid was received by an unexpected ally in the Phantom's Wrath, flagship battle barge of the Executioner's Chapter, and her accompanying Gladius-class frigate escorts, which had been taking on supplies at the inhabited ocean world of Deluge, on the edge of the Magog cluster. Their combined battle group attacked the wounded Loyalist vessels as they moved toward the warp transfer point at Kalach to embark once again. The light cruiser Admiral Gregorius was blasted to atoms in the opening salvo of the Successionist guns. The Pyre of Glory quickly proved to be far less easy prey. The Salamander's mighty battle barge managed to repel the first boarding assaults against her and destroy 2 of the attacking frigates. But after a 3-hour-long running battle, the Phantom's Wrath managed to entirely disable the Pyre of Glory's thrusters, leaving it dead in space. High Mortiurge, which refers to High Chaplain, Tusla Kane Vox signaled the Salamander's vessel and offered them the chance for honorable surrender, vouching safe passage for them from the war zone under oath not to take up arms again in the conflict. Captain Pelas Mirsan conceded to this demand, despite the misgivings of some of those under his command, knowing that to do so would risk his force being destroyed without being able to strike back at their foe. Having himself fought alongside the Executioner's Chapter centuries before as a scout marine neophyte, he trusted to their oath of offered surety. Whatever. Both of Phaeton's wrath and Hicarnia drew alongside the battered Pyre of Glory and docked. Tuslakane personally leading the executioners, a boarding party, and accepting Mirsan's sword and surrender, as the salamanders stood down their arms. It was then elsewhere within the great ship the unthinkable occurred. Thanks to the conditions of the surrender, Archcenturion Commodus led his own boarding party to seize the Pyre of Glory's armories, nearly unopposed. Heedless of the consequences, Commodus sought to breach the ship's sanctum vaults and seize not only the recovered gene seed from the caverns of Chaprias, but also the salamander's own recovered stock from the fatality sustained during the conflict. When the salamander's apothecaries resisted, Commodus cut them down. He then unleashed his unfettered wrath upon the salamanders, ordering the massacre of the salamanders they had taken prisoner. He then ordered his corpse takers to strip them of their gene seed, whether alive or dead. A pitched battle quickly broke out across the decks. As reports reached the bridge of what was happening, Tuslakane was incensed with murderous rage. Seeing this reaction, Mirsan wisely divined that the executioners may not have posed full knowledge of the heresy and blasphemy committed by the Astral Claws, perhaps having been deliberately deceived by the Tyrant of Badab. Controlling his own outrage, Mirsan poured deliberate scorn on the executioner's leader, both for this breach of his word and the dishonor of standing by and allowing the tyrant's sins to go unchallenged. With the reports of his executioner's own eyes giving the gravity of truth to Mirsan's claims, Kane's wrath was terrible to behold. He declared that the blood oath binding his chapter to Huron's cause had been violated, and the dark stain of infamy the Astral Claws had brought upon them could only be washed clean by a river of blood. Those salamander battle brothers that have survived what was to come have since given witness that the bleak madness came upon the executioners at Kane's pronouncement, and that they tore into the Astral Claws with a murderous vengeance, heedless of the risk to their own lives, satisfied only that their former allies would die by their hands, regardless of the cost. Captain Mirsan rallied his surviving Salamander's brethren and mounted the defense of the battle barge's inner sanctum, unleashing the power of the mighty ancients, the dreadnoughts, led by Breyart Ashmantle, the Iron Dragon, of course, upon the apostate Astral Claws. First, the corridors and vaults of the Pyre of Glory, and then the Astral Claws Hicarnia ran red with blood. This dreadful battle became known in the legends as the Red Hour, as every single Astral Claw, chapter serf, and servitor present was relentlessly hunted down and slaughtered. The Hicarnia was left a carnal house of decapitated bodies, as the executioners took more than 200 heads from their former allies. Tuslakane came alone before the Salamander's commander, Captain Mirsan, and knelt in the light of the burning sanctum's braziers. Offering him no words, he presented a single gory object which rolled at Miran's feet, the head of the Astral Claws Archcenturion, Commodus. Without further comment, the executioners withdrew, leaving the stricken Salamander's battle barge and the empty Astral Claws strike cruiser docked alongside. The executioner's maddened desire for vengeance had not been saturated, and soon his message reached every corner of the Maelstrom Zone. From this point onward, the executioner's chapter became a rogue element in the conflict, not only seeking out and descending with suicidal fury on the Astral Claws and their agents wherever they could be found, but also refusing to surrender to loyalist forces when encountered. The most notorious incident of this kind occurred when the executioners deployed the Sons of Medusa strike cruiser. The most notorious incident of this kind occurred when the executioners destroyed the Sons of Medusa strike cruiser Warspite and the grief system in 911. But there were other incidents as well. Beyond these lamentable incidents, the Executioner's Chapter's attacks on wider Imperial shipping ceased almost immediately. These unusual developments were only explained some solar months later, when the badly wrecked Pyre of Glory finally limped into port at the Loyalist battle station at Cerngrad, with their strange and bloody tale to tell. For the Tyrant of Badab's cause, there could have been no more bitter blow than that struck by these allies turned enemies. Not only had the serving of the executioners from the Successionists robbed Huron's forces of much of its remaining strength and warships and raider craft, but as foes the executioners were both impeccable and had the advantage of detailed knowledge of many of the Successionists' hidden bases and deployments, which they put to immediate use in destroying them. When first the Lamenters and the Mantis warriors shorn from the Successionist order of battle, with first the Lamenters and then the Mantis warriors shorn from the Successionist order of battle, and almost barely the Executioners turned against him, Huron and what remained of his once mighty Astral Claws were truly alone before the Imperium's wrath. Their dreams of dominion and eternal glory shattered. The Tyrant stands alone. An order for death. Following what he regarded as the treachery of his former allies, Huron announced in a recorded message that was relayed throughout the war zone that the Astral Claws and their subjects no longer were part of the Imperium of Man. Up until this point, although the Badab Successionists had been declared heretic by the Imperium, within the worlds they had controlled, the pattern of established life had gone on much as it had for many centuries, and the worship of the God Emperor had been maintained. Those Adeptus Ministorum prelates that had overtly disagreed with the Successionists have been removed and replaced with those more amiable to the Tyrant of Badab's cause, and millions still followed their faith unimpeded, while the Badab sector's native defenders believed naturally enough that they fought and died in a battle against heresy, rather than in its name. But now the truth was no longer concealed from the pitiable masses of the sector. Within Huron's remaining domains, all signs and symbols of imperial authority, culture, and religious creed were cast down in a firestorm of iconoclasm. The mass executions on Badab Primaris of ecclesiarchy clerics and functionaries, most of whom remained largely ignorant of the true cause and nature of the conflict, was said to last for solar weeks without pause. Reports from inquisitorial agents that had infiltrated the Badab sector reported at this time that conditions on its principal world grew ever harsher, famine and want commonplace, and despair's shadow fell over all. As for the Astral Claws themselves, although the practice was by no means universal, many of the Battle Brothers began to deface any semblance of imperial heraldry and insignia from their armor and war gear, scouring it to bare metal or daubing it in reds and crimsons in representation of their blood oath of vengeance, until only the symbol of the Tyrant of Badab remained. Whereas before the population of the Badab sector had been controlled with inflexible and savage discipline, but were still viewed as a war resource to be maintained and managed, now the Astral Claws' wrath grew ever more arbitrary and brutal as their increasing paranoia and the murderous rages to which Huron was becoming prone took their toll on those unfortunates caught within the tyrant's domain. On Badab Primaris, for non Astartes to dare to look directly upon the face of one of the Astral Claws was now punishable by blinding, and after an assassin tried to take the life of Huron with his own command chamber, the assailant being slain by the tyrant himself, non-space marines were banned entirely from the precincts of the Palace of Thorns on pain of death. Thousands of civilians were killed in groundless reprisal by the Astral Claws' retaliators. By this point, the mindset of the Astral Claws themselves had succumbed to a siege mentality, for they expected death as now inevitable, but were spurred on by a bleak desire for vengeance against those they believed had wronged them, spite and rage consuming what little remained of their honor. Invasion of Piraeus. Lord High Commander Karab Kholn, having waited as long as he thought was strategically advantaged to gather his forces for a heavy assault, put his plan for the invasion and conquest of the Piraeus system on the edge of the Badab system into action. The Piraeus system had been identified as the key to the subsequent attack on the central Badab system, due in no small part to the relatively stable warp route between the two regions. A plan long in fruition, Cullen had already set up a series of secondary fronts at Isin and Decabalus, where raids and hit-and-run actions by his own Red Scorpions chapter, along with the Minotaurs and Exorcists, had destabilized much of the region and forced the Tyrant of Badab's armies to spread their outer defenses thinly. The initial attack would occur with an Imperial Navy assault to interdict the industrial world of Piraeus 5, also known locally as Yaros Station, with a direct Space Marine assault against the lunar colonies on the second moon of Piraeus, Piraeus' dominant gas giant, Kiritas. This attack was to be conducted by the combined forces of the Exorcist and the Red Scorpions chapters, their strike force amounting to an effective strength of 6 Space Marine companies. The majority of Space Marine contingent was made up of fresh reinforcements of the Exorcist chapter, who Lord Commander Cullen had kept in reserve for this closing stage of the war, although overall tactical command of the assault was taken up by Cullen himself. From the start, the invasion of the Piraeus system was subject to reversal and unexpected calamity. As the Loyalist invasion fleet left the Larsa system, one of the Imperial Navy cruisers attached to the force, the Spear of Mendoza, suffered a catastrophic Giller field failure, hurling all on board screaming to their doom in the Materium. Several other ships were either damaged or scattered due to the unexpected turbulence and the usually stable warp routes. This forced the ill-fated fleet to arrive piecemeal at the target's system edge, further out than had been planned. The Loyalist starships were forced to reassemble and operate at maximum thruster burn for a number of solar days to reach the inner worlds of Piraeus, after which time all elements of surprise had been lost. The Loyalist fleet had little choice but to press the attack. The bulk of the Imperial naval ships, led by the Retribution-class battleship, Torn of Blood, broke off to engage the defense fleet and bombard Piraeus 5, while the Space Marine strike force diverted the assault to the moon of Kiritas Secundus. A flotilla of planetary assault craft ferrying Astra Militarium and Inquisitorial forces formed the rear echelon intended to consolidate and exploit a successful Astartes attack. Initial enemy resistance in space proved insufficient to slow the attack down, even though the Imperial forces sporadically encountered minefields that were breached or bypassed without loss. The secessionist armada around Piraeus 5 stood little chance of long delaying, let alone preventing the Loyalist force assembled by Lord High Commander Cullen from their inevitable assault. The fighting above Piraeus 5 proved particularly fierce, as defense ships flung themselves almost suicidally against their attackers. The Imperial Navy ships, however, were prevented from achieving their secondary objective of close bombardment of Piraeus 5, as ground fire from massive emplacements of macro cannon and defense laser batteries on the surface, unpredicted in strength and ferocity, forced the naval ship back. God, that was a long one. Elsewhere in orbit of Kiritas Secundus, despite strong resistance, greater success was found by the Loyalists, and between them the combined might of the Red Scorpion, Sword of Ordon, and the Exorcist Redeemer smashed aside the moon's asteroid forts in the short order. Landing zones in the vicinity of the lunar colony's main citadels and generatora stations were quickly identified and subjected to preliminary bombardment before a full-scale planet strike was initiated via Thunderhawk and drop pod assault. On landing, the Red Scorpions and Exorcists were immediately met head-on by the mortal auxilia of the Tyrant's Legion in a strong counteroffensive. Their enemies' numbers increased several-fold by indentured workers, driven on by the use of explosive colors and armed with little more than sharpened tools and crude Prometheum bombs. Though the assaulting Space Marines killed the Tyrant's Legion auxilia and their slave worker allies in droves, their numbers slowed the transhumans' attackers down, preventing them from spreading out to assault their individual targets as planned. It was at this point, when the bulk of the Red Scorpions and the Exorcist chapters were both bottled in their landing zones, that the Astral Claws sprung their trap. Previously silent and long-concealed ground batteries fire from the depths of the alien fortress that covered the moon, striking down Thunderhawks and landing craft and ripping into the Space Marine warships in close orbit above. From within the moon's citadel, cannons and mortars thundered afresh, pelting the loyalist Space Marines with missiles and shell, indiscriminately targeting the battles where their own forces were engaged at close quarters with the loyalists. This was only a heralding barrage, however, and from their concealed bunkers, scores of land raiders, tanks, and rhino transports bearing the insignia of the Tyrant of Badab roared forth. The near chapter strength of the Astral Claws with their master, Huron, leading at the fore, Lord High Commander... there's a pause there. Lord High Commander Cullen and those Space Marines that stood with him were caught between a crossfire from above and the Tyrant below. The Tyrant had long ago divined the importance of the Piraeus system as a keystone in the Badab sector's defense, and drew his own plans accordingly. The presence of a concentration of Astral Claws on Kiritas, and the secret upgrading and cunning deployment of his defenses had not been the whole of the Tyrant's strategy either. And within a solar hour of the hidden guns of Kiritas Secundus opening fire and cutting off the loyalist spearhead from its supporting ships, the Tyrant's own war fleet ripped into real space at the edge of the inner Piraeus system. What was to follow was to be one of the largest and last major fleet engagements of the Badab War. With the final remaining operable battle barge in the Astral Claws fleet, the mighty and storied Seraph of Judgment, the Successionist Armada represented the last exercise of their once vaunted naval power. Outgunned, the senior Imperial Navy Admiral realized that the tactical situation had suddenly shifted, and quickly ascertained that if the Tyrant's fleet could take on two Loyalist forces, both of which had already sustained damage, and expended considerable stocks of their ordnance, separately, they might yet attain a crushing victory. But if fought simultaneously, the Loyalists would be far more evenly matched against them. With communications with the ongoing ground war impossible, it was with a heavy heart that Captain Waiter Ryder, the Exorcist Master of the fleet, reluctantly agreed with the Vice Admiral's dire assessment of the situation, and complied with his plan of feigned retreat and rendezvous. With their enemies seemingly in full fight before them, the Successionist fleet ravaged into the inner system at full speed, striking at targets of opportunity such as the ungainly Loyalist rear echelon transports. Thousands of the embarked troops aboard these Imperial transports died as a result. On the planet's surface, savage fighting raged on as the Loyalists and Successionists clashed without mercy. The Astral Claws came on in savage and bitter fury as the Red Scorpions met them with righteous hatred of their own, while the Exorcists displayed their usual unnerving calm in the face of overwhelming force. Lord High Commander Cullen stood at the fore. At his side was Severin Loth, Chief Librarian of the chapter. Huron struck the Exorcist's battle line ferociously, smashing aside Space Marines with contemptuous ease. The tyrant's blood spattered personal guard poured into the breach behind him, forming a murderous wedge as the tyrant strove to reach his true and chosen enemy, Karab Colin. Captain Silas Alberic, commander of the Exorcist forces, led the counter-assault force of his chapter's elite Enochian guard to confront the tyrant head-on, and attempt to blunt his attack and prevent the momentum of the battle from shifting at the critical juncture. Instead of being matched with the tyrant, Silas Alberic found himself in a duel with Ancient Claytor, one of the most feared and infamous of the Astral Claws dreadnoughts. The Exorcist captain suffered a terrible wound, which crushed and crippled his Terminator armor before he was able to disable the dreadnought's motive systems with his master-crafted relic mace, the Hellslayer, felling the great metal beast. As the battle continued to rage, the two chapter masters at last found each other, and Karab Colin and Huron matched their skill in personal combat. The Tyrant of Badab charged the Red Scorpion chapter master in a fury, bellowing his rage and blaspheming the Emperor bitterly, while Cullen fought in grim silence, concentrating on countering the frenzied blows of the tyrant's relic lightning claw, known as the Ghost Razors, with the ancient heirloom of its chapter, the blade of the Scorpion. Soon Cullen was covered in dozens of bleeding wounds. It was at this point, when the two warriors parted the exchange of blows, that Cullen finally spoke, taunting the tyrant with accusations of his own. Further maddened by these insults, the Tyrant of Badab howled in rage, charging at the Red Scorpion again. But Cullen expected the frenzied attacks, and deftly turned aside, allowing the tyrant's momentum to take him past. In a blow that would have normally felled even the mightiest of Space Marines, Cullen lashed out with the blade of the Scorpion and slashed deeply into the tyrant's side, parting his foe's armor in a welter of blood. But the tyrant shrugged off his opponent's attack and wheeled around, his claws arching down and the ghostly blades punching through Karab Cullen's breastplate. Only through momental effort was Cullen able to fight on through his agony, hurling himself backwards onto the ground before the tyrant could close his clawed fingers and rip out his heart. The Red Scorpion then slid down a slope of rubble and armored bodies before the looming tyrant, whose bitter laugh echoed above him. Cullen staggered once more to his feet, direly wounded as the battle continued to rage around him. Then, suddenly, a new sun burned the heavens, raining destruction down on all below. Gambling on a dangerous plan to extract the forces stranded below, Captain Radar bargained that the planetary defense would be half blinded by the battle raging above them in orbit. The Exorcist battle barge Redeemer was among the least skated, its base filled with capacity with surviving Thunderhawks from across the fleet for the emergency operation. The vast battle barge sliced into Kiritas Secundus' thin atmosphere. The ground batteries proved ineffective against her, as the fire striking all around her shields made the Redeemer appear as a terrible blazing sun in the sky, and the panicked defense crews failed to quickly respond. Librarian Talot of the Exorcist was able to lock in on the bright soul of Severin Loth in the warp, and the familiar spark of his wounded master Alberic, and so the Redeemer made for its intended target. At this unexpected arrival, the Astral Claws were hurled back amid the storm of dust and debris. And below its sky-bolting bulk, the battlefield where Cullen and the Tyrant fought was showered in rubble and flame, parting them before their combat could reach a final conclusion in either's favor. Immediate extraction operations got underway before the enemy could rally to the defense as the Redeemer's guns rent the ground asunder and pulverized the towers of nearby citadels. In a desperate operation lasting near 2 solar hours, almost 3 and 5, 2 solar hours, almost 3 and 5 of the Loyalist Space Marines had made planetfall were recovered, although most of them were either casualties or bore some fresh wound or scar to mark the furious combat they had seen. No least of the wounded was Commander Cullen, who was taken up in the care of his chapter's apothecaries. Above Kiritas, battle had once again been joined between the Loyalists and the Successionist warships. The Successionists both outnumbered the Loyalists and outgunned them, but the Loyalists, even though many of their vessels were damaged, had the great number of heavy warships in their line of battle, and were far greater in quality of skilled and disciplined crew. The rebel fleet came on a chaotic and ragged attack column, and this was to prove their undoing, as the combined Imperial Navy and Adeptus Astartes warships formed into tight formation and crossed laterally in an oblique pass on the enemy column, maximizing their broadsides while the Successionists could not fully bring theirs to bear. The star battle was eventually won for the Loyalists, with the death of the Seraph of Judgment, but at a great cost. And there remained a great deal of bloody fighting to do, as the surviving enemy ships were put to flight or captured in a series of brutal boarding assaults. The invasion of Piraeus was over. Both sides claimed the victory, and both sides tasted defeat. For the Successionists, the Loyalist invaders had been driven off, and not one iota of ground had been surrendered to them. But in doing so, they had gambled the last of their once mighty fleet, and lost it, and with it any hope of maintaining dominion outside of the Badab system itself. Fatalities on both sides had been appalling high, and Lord Commander Cullen had seen his attacking force blunted, and many of his most powerful ships of the line damaged to the extent that might take standard years to repair. The Badab War had arguably been won at Piraeus by the Loyalists, but there was one last battle to fight, and that was likely to be the most terrible of all: the final siege of Badab itself. Let's begin. The Fall of Badab, the Silent War, 912. After the tumultuous events surrounding the failed invasion of the Piraeus system and the unknown status of the Executioner's Chapter, the Badab War entered a new and uncertain era. The Successionists were at their lowest ebb during the conflict, and the Loyalists hadn't fared any better after the substantial losses they had sustained in the recent campaign. They were in no position to exploit their enemy's weakness or press the attack. From the aftermath of the invasion of Piraeus, the mid-division of 912 of the 41st millennium became known as the Silent War, as it was composed of hundreds of small-scale engagements, many of which went all but unreported and unknown. The Maelstrom Zone could not be considered pacified by any means, despite the sundering of the Successionist domains, and it was only the presence of the Loyalist detachment of the Minotaurs and Sons of Medusa chapters that kept the Imperial line of supplies viable. Without the thinly spread Astra Militarum and Inquisition forces attached to the Loyalist command, the retaken worlds in the Pale Stars region would have slid into anarchy or succumbed to the same civil strife that had stricken those in the Galen system. Soon the Loyalist command received word that the Tyrant of Badab's forces were falling back to the Badab system, striping the defenses from worlds such as Isin and Decabalus, abandoning them to their fates. Matters became further confused when it appeared that some forces of the Tyrant's Legion, and even some small splinter groups of Astral Claws, had abandoned their master, turned fully renegade, and made an attempt to flee into the Maelstrom Zone, while once again Corsairs and Xenos sightings began to increase across the western and southern zone. Potentially spread out over a vast area of dangerous wilderness space, the Loyalists now seemed to face multiple foes whose action could not be readily predicted. If the Loyalists did not take the strategic initiative, the conflict could spread slowly throughout the entire region, possibly taking solar decades, if not standard centuries, to quell. The injured but still active Lord High Commander Karab Colin convened a full council of war at the newly commissioned Imperial battle station complex in the Vinaya system to determine a strategy and divine a future course of the war. Representatives from all the Loyalist Space Marine chapters still involved in the conflict were present. Colin's own Red Scorpions, the Salamanders, Minotaurs, Exorcists, Carcadons, and Sons of Medusa. The Firehawk's master, the now ailing Stibor Lazarek, was summoned as an equal, despite reservations held by others. Some stain of blame and suspicion of dissent still persisted among some of his peers. Inquisitor Legate Yardenais Frame, whose voice was that of the High Lords of Terra in the Council, served as arbiter, and at Frame's personal invitation, a deputation of the Archmagi of the Forge World Angstrom was also received, and now finally welcomed as allies to the Loyalist cause. Legate Inquisitor Frame brought the news to the Council that the Mantis Warriors chapter had finally submitted themselves before the Legate's authority to avoid utter destruction of their worlds. But he brought ill-omened news as well. Reinforcements from the Alstra Militarum Segmentum, reserves, and fresh warships from the Imperial Navy would not be forthcoming. Wars and conflicts were everywhere, and matters pressing against the Tyranid threat and newly arising Xenos powers, the Galactic East, claimed priority on all that might be gathered to the Loyalist cause on short notice. However, the darkly reputed Star Phantoms chapter were en route at full chapter strength and would be with the Loyalists by the year's turning. The Adeptus Mechanicus of Angstrom would provide further aid to the Loyalist cause by granting a bounty of arms and munitions. They also vowed to aid the Loyalist attack from Badab Primaris when the hour of battle came. In accordance with the Loyalists' newly formed strategies, and with the hard lessons of Piraeus well learned, the ultimate goal of the investiture and siege of Badab Primaris would now be delayed until overwhelming forces were available. In the meantime, an enhanced blockade and watch would be maintained there, while the Maelstrom Zone was brought better under its heel. The Firehawk's immense mobile fortress monastery, the Raptorus Rex, was brought to the Piraeus system to form the linchpin of the reinforced blockade. But when the Loyalists arrived in system, they found it half-abandoned shambles. Kirita Secundus was ravaged and near lifeless, and Yaros station had been gutted and was now famine-stricken by its former Astral Claws masters, and left to their fate. The Firehawk's wrath sealed the fate of the traders below with a protracted orbital bombardment. The Carcadons were recalled from the Endymion cluster, having completed their work in accordance with the Mantis Warrior surrender agreement. The Carcadons' large fleet, along with ships from the Exorcist and Sons of Medusa chapters, were assigned into small battle groups alongside Imperial Navy scouting vessels and dispatched on independent hunter-killer missions throughout the Maelstrom Zone. Depths of honor. With the Badab War drawing to its bloody conclusion, there remained a few major matters to settle. This was especially true in regards to the Executioner's chapter. It soon came to pass that the Sons of Medusa and Carcadon's chapter began to coordinate their effort to hunt down the elusive chapter. They had discovered what they believed was their center of operation in the Dene Stellar Drift, and they intended to prosecute a campaign of annihilation against them. Sons of Medusa, yeah. I thought it was Minotaurs. As skirmish and clashes between them began to escalate, The Salamander's captain, Pelas Mirsan, was deeply troubled. The executioners had acted with honor during the war, and moreover, he felt his own chapter owed them a debt not easily repaid following the events of the Red Hour. Renewed by the arrival of the Salamander's vanguard cruiser, Obsidia, and the half-company of battle brothers freshly returned from the Segmentum Solar, Mirsan took it upon himself to seek out the leader of the executioners, Tusla Kane, and attempt to parley and negotiated an end a negotiated end to the executioner's role in the world. Questing along the Maelstrom Zone's southern periphery for several solar months, the Obsidia rushed in response to reports of battle at the fringes of the Eridane Cataract. There they found the executioner's battle barge, Phantom's Wrath, and the infamous Night Hag hunting down two damaged Sons of Medusa strike cruisers in the dense asteroid fields and dust clouds of the turbulent star system. Without second thought to his own ship's safety, Captain Mirsan interposed his vessel between the two warring sides and deactivated his ship's weapons. He then demanded that an honorable discourse between brothers take place. The Loyalist forces faced a tense standoff, coming to the brink of warring amongst themselves, but Miran was successful in forcing both sides to stand down. He then negotiated that the Sons of Medusa's departure and the executioner's ceasefire, bringing the Night Hag with Kane aboard, under the Salamander's own personal flag of safety, to formal parley with the Loyalist command. Though shadowed with the warp echoes of prowling Carcadon's warships en route to Crow's world, they were not attacked. Many of the Loyalist side had a mind to arrest or even slay the executioners on sight, but the voice of Pelas Mirsan, a respected representative of his first founding chapter, was not so easily dismissed, nor were the likely consequences should blood be shed dishonorably at this time. Seeing the strategic wisdom of being able to remove a dangerous and unpredictable chapter bloodlessly from the war, Lord High Commander Karab Colin acquiesced, he agreed to Mirsan's proposal in regards to the executioners. But the Magister Militium of the Adeptus Astartes forces added a few caveats of his own. The terms of honorable armistice stated that the executioners would end all hostilities and quit the region of the Maelstrom Zone entirely, never to return. The bulk of their surviving forces were then to travel to their distant home system under oath to remain there until full judgment could later be passed on their actions by a full consistorial court of inquiry. The acting executioner commander, Tusla Kane, his chosen honor guard and crew, along with the Night Hag, voluntarily gave themselves over to the Salamander's custody and were interred at the Salamander's chapter homeworld of Nocturne until the end of the war. From this point on, the Salamander's chapter stood as guarantors of the executioner's compliance and conduct, although there remained those on the Loyalist side who, though bound to obedience in the matter, would never forget the bad blood between them. Breaking the Ring of Steel. Though my guards may sleep and my ships may lay at anchor, our foes know full well that the big guns never tire. Huron, Lufgt Huron, the Tyrant of Badab, circa 909. But the breaking of the Ring of Steel is 930. The Loyalists were ready at last to begin the final siege of the Badab system. Their forces had been greatly augmented by the arrival of the Grim Star Phantom's Chapter, whose fleet carried a powerful force 10 companies strong, as well as a maniple of battle titans of the Legio Crucius, the Warmongers, brought in by the intervention of the Adeptus Mechanicus of Angstrom, and several heavy warships such as the Sword of Ordon, which had been brought back into full operation. The initial attack itself would not be easy, as the Loyalists first had to sunder the infamous Ring of Steel, which held sufficient firepower to hold off almost any fleet of attackers, turning the void between its planets into a deadly maze of minefields and interlocking fire zones. But the Loyalist High Command had come up with an unorthodox plan to counter this threat with minimal losses, which would allow for an immediate planetary assault. The key to this plan was twofold, and relied both on the arcane arts of the Magi of Angstrom and the effects of the Tyrant of Badab's own growing paranoia. The greatest vulnerability of the Ring of Steel was that it was largely static. The position of its various minefields and massive armed star forts were predictable, and what few defense ships and armed vessels of any size Badab possessed were insufficient to turn the tide against a concentrated localized attack. The heavily defended star fortresses orbiting Sigma, or Badab 6, was the cornerstone of the outer system's defense. Loyalist spies had discovered here, at Sentinel Sigma, was the primary node of control which had been placed under the control of one of the few subordinates the tyrant still trusted, the infamous Astral Claws Captain, Corian Sumatris. This was done so that the control of the star forts and minefields wouldn't be controlled autonomously by scores of commanders the tyrant thought unreliable. Taking Sentinel Sigma intact would silence the legendary big guns of the Badab system. The Loyalist Assault Armada entered real space in the Badab system on... they messed up a few numbers here, but it's like 913 of the 31st millennia, of course. High up on the vertical plane of the planetary system, directly on an attack course for Badab 6. The Armada consisted of no fewer than 6 Space Marine battle barges, 9 strike cruisers, along with 6 other Imperial Navy ships of the line, an Adeptus Mechanicus war caravel, and 84 escorts and strike vessels of various classes. At its vanguard was the mobile star fortress, Rapturus Rex, behind which, thanks to the Artan ship of the Magi of Angstrom, was towered a burning stellar core fragment torn bodily from the Baal Cascade. As the war machines of the Badab system sprang to life in response to the threat, it was already too late to prevent what was to happen next. Swiftly reaching terminal velocity, the ponderous cyclopean bulk of the Rapturus Rex engaged its main drive at maximum power to alter course, straining against inertia to allow the hellish fire of the stellar fragment to pass it by on its collision course with the Sentinel Sigma battle station. While the Loyalist Armada fell into a spearhead formation a safe distance behind. Unable to escape the path of the rogue star fragment, soon every weapon on the defense line, within range and resolution, was trained on the tumbling fireball. Blinded by the light of this new and terrible star careening towards them, the weapons of the Ring of Steel could not clearly see, let alone target the oncoming armada. This caused the legions of mines and weapons platforms targeter arrays to set upon each other, setting off waves of atomic detonations throughout the void. Only at the near point-blank range did the defense lasers and arc cannon of the star forts have any effect on the blurring stellar matter, causing the fragment to be rent apart in a great wave of energy which was washed over Sentinel Sigma, painting it in its falling void shields with lambent flame and burning through defense ships and fighters in a torrent of destruction. Hard in the wake of the energy storm came the Angels of Death in unrelenting fury as boarding torpedoes and assault rams smashed into reeling Sentinel Sigma, carrying with them the might of the Sons of Medusa and Exorcist chapters. Soon they were met in deadly combat amid the station's vaults and corridors by combat servitors and the suicidal fury of the vaunted Astral Claws Second Company and their commander, the arch-swordsman, Corian Sumatris. As the boarding action raged, the battle barges Sword of Ordon, and the Star Phantom's Memento Mori led a wing of strike cruisers to assault the burned and blinded Starfort network at the point-blank range, taking one after the other intact in a series of brutal boarding assaults which left none they found within alive. Meanwhile, the Minotaurs carry out strikes upon the system's other inhabited spheres, Badab Secundus and Rigel, with brutal efficiency. The darkly famed masters of the Minotaurs, Asterion Moloch, hurled the members of Badab Secundus' ruling satrapy from the spire of its oratory cathedral. This he did after impaling the Astral Claws Chaplain, Varna Sabin, to the front of his personal Land Raider transport as an example to traitors of the fate that awaited them. Standing atop a mound of broken bodies, Vailud Kal, Iron Thane of the Sons of Medusa, communicated to Loyalist High Command that Sentinel Sigma was theirs. He was joined via teleporter by the Mechanicus Lord of Angstrom. They did what Huron and his court had considered unthinkable. Within solar hours, the Loyalists had subjugated the station's Silica Animus, artificial intelligence apparently, and with it accessed the many machine spirits and weapons slaved to it. Inconvertibly, override and destruct signals were sent out across the void. This function was only possible because of the possessive paranoia of the Tyrant in his effort to control a system so large. In response to the command, the outer Badab system became a sea of fire. The ring of steel had been shattered, and only Badab Primaris and the defenses that encircled it remained. Final assault on Badab Primaris. With the star system now under Loyalist control, deployment of the Exorcist Chapter along with the Imperial Navy detachments were put into place to blockade the star system to ensure none would escape what was to come. Meanwhile, the surviving defense ships were quickly put into place to surround and besiege Badab Primaris. Initially, the mobile star fortress, Raptorus Rex, was to spearhead the assault, but that was no longer possible due to the strain of the stellar core fragment attack, which caused significant structural damage, which destabilized the engines of the vast craft, making close orbital operations impossible. Though the guns of the Badab Primaris were still greatly feared, the Star Phantoms asked for, and had been granted, the glory of leading the first assault wave. It was their ancient battle barge, Memento Mori, which would be the spearhead of the attack, braving the guns of Badab Primaris. A hastily revised plan of attack called for a three-pronged offensive. For further hazard to the Loyalists' assault was presented in the form of the High Guard Orbital Station, which had been initially used as the Astral Claws Fortress Monastery before Huron had descended to take over the Palace of Thrones on the surface of Badab Primaris below. 2 companies of the Star Phantom Space Marines would form the first axis of attack, assaulting the High Guard Orbital Fortress in concert with the smaller Firehawks and Sons of Medusa contingents. The second would be led by the Carcadons as they would descend in full force to the surface of Badab Primaris' hive cities to crush any opposition. The third and most vital attack force would be formed by the bulwark of the Star Phantoms, consisting of 7 full companies and assisted by heavy assault elements drawn from across the Loyalist chapters and Inquisitorial Stormtrooper companies. This would enable the Loyalists to take the battle to the heart of the foe and besiege the Palace of Thorns itself. Heralding the attack was a wave of orbital bombardment and hurled debris from orbits sent to sow havoc below as weapons fire split the sky above Badab Primaris. The sable-colored Memento Mori led the attack as it breached the upper atmosphere, rocked by explosions from the planet's surface weapons emplacements. The Star Phantom's battle barge answered in kind, with roaring cannons and vortex missiles, ripping great craters in the planet's surface. Behind the dauntless battle barge, dozens of other warships swept low, releasing their deadly payloads. The skies darkened as wave after wave of midnight-clad and cold gray painted drop pods rained down in precisely executed assaults. Blazing bright lances of energy pierced upwards, futilely trying to starve off the attackers. The Carcadon's relic flagship, Nikor, unleashed a devastating blast from its vast plasma destructor weapon concealed in its belly, burning a great trench in the Badab Primaris surface and sundering the bastion wall of Badab Primaris' main city, Hive Dominor. Soon after, Thunderhawk gunships and Castus assault rams speared down to exploit the breach. The burning pall of smoke, swirling cinder ash and choking dust, blackened the sky, causing night to fall over Badab's northern continent as the siege assault raged. A full solar hour had passed since the opening of the Loyalist assault, and though the defense batteries had not yet been fully silenced, many were now choked off or destroyed. Descending perilously through the storm of smoke and fire were troop ships and thunderhawks, fearing their reinforcements and heavy armor down to the chaos of the ground assault. As the approach was deemed safe, the colossal landing craft of the Legio Crucius fell to the earth outside Hive Dominar, the tremor shock of their impact shaking the ground, breaking even more of the breach bastion wall tumbling down. Titans now walked on Badab, immediately setting out to do the Emperor's work. Vast armored doors opened and slammed buildings flat as the Titan sirens echoed across the battlefield, bellowing their clarion call of doom for the beleaguered world. Hive Dominar soon became a city of death as the assault moved into its second and then third solar hour without any sign of relenting. The mortal of the Tyrant's Legion fought an insane and desperate battle against the great transhuman giants of the Carcadons that walked amongst them. There were no means of escaping their gruesome fate as transit junctions became clogged with burning vehicles and shattered rubble, trapping the wretched civilians within the doomed Hive City. There was nothing but terror and death. The soldiers of the Auxilia bitterly fought on as best as they could, faced with the choice of surrender or survival. But the unstoppable great tide of the Carcadons fell upon them with nightmarish fury, savagely hacking through their defense lines, leaving nothing but torn bodies and shattered war machines in their wake. Command and control quickly broke down within the ranks of the Tyrant's Legion, as their voxits uttered nothing but screams and unanswered pleas for mercy. Soon the carnage only worsened, as fire began to spread and rage out of control. Those auxilia that managed to survive began shelling indiscriminately into the shadows of the buildings in the vain hope of stopping the savage assault of the Carcadons. But their efforts were for naught. Fall of the Palace of Thorns. To the northeast of Hive Dominar lay the Palace of Thorns, built into a mountainous volcanic plateau that rose high above the level of the Hive City. It comprised a hulking, ornate citadel surrounded by wide, statue-lined plazas and myriad-capped gun towers studded with defense lasers and flak batteries. This was the heart of the Astral Claws domain and the lair of the Tyrant of Badab. Above the palace complex center, an very bright lightning shield rippled and clashed in the air. A vast charged power field that disintegrated anything it could touch. It touched and shrugged off even the firepower of the warships above. The plazas and weapon batteries that spread out beyond the palace were not so impervious, however, and it was into them that the star phantoms descended with unmatched precision and timing, their drop pods smashing through the ornate sepulchres and toppling needle-thin opex masts as they descended. Despite the hail of fire that had greeted the star phantoms, Over 500 battle brothers out of the 700-strong force managed to survive to make planetfall. And now they set about besieging the heavily protected Palace of Thorns. The combat was fierce as the Star Phantoms encountered cunning death traps and heavily defended gun positions. Brutal, close-range engagements were fought against Astral Claws assault squads, who counterattacked from concealed sally ports, making the Loyalists pay in blood for every advance. Land Raiders and Predators spilled forth from the underground bunkers in defense of the Citadel's shield wall, but they were matched by the equally devastating firepower of the Star Phantom's Devastator squads and dreadnoughts, firing from the shattered towers they had already stormed. The wide open plaza that ringed the Citadel became lethal killing grounds, grinding the siege down into a bloody meat grinder of attrition, for they offered very little cover to both attackers and defenders alike. The bloody siege began to tip into the Loyalists' favor as the Inquisitorial Stormtroopers regiments made their way up the volcanic ridges and joined the fray, allowing the Star Phantoms to press the attack. Loyalist Terminator squads locked on the Star Phantom's teleport homers and were soon dispatched down to the surface. But despite the massive force brought to bear against it, the Citadel still held. The Palace of Thorns lightning field remained unbreached, and multiple Loyalist attacks were hurled away from the Citadel as the Astral Claws rained down deadly fire from their high walls and murderous counterattacks. Even with the advent of the Reaver-class Titans of the Legio Curtius, alongside the Sons of Medusa detachments, the Loyalists could not force the issue. The siege of the Palace of Thorns was a lethal impasse. The fighting and killing reigned unabated as true night fell over Hive Dominar and the Palace of Thorns. Soon the fighting spread out to the palace's sub-hives and industrial zones. The pall of smoke from the burning cities thickened the night to an umbral black that fogged the apex of the warships in orbit. Titans stalked the ruined cityscapes, crushing any hint of resistance they encountered, and systematically smashed the manufactoria and habitation blocks, driving refugees and routed Tyrant's Legion troopers before them in a disordered swarm. During this long night of destruction, little can be said for certain of Huron's actions. Some reports have the Tyrant of Badab sighted almost everywhere in the defense of the palace, hurling back the rent and shattered bodies of his enemies, roaring his defiance, while other tales place him alone and silent in the throne chamber, impassively watching the destruction of all he had wrought in the flickering light of his whole sphere. Regardless of the truth, what can be accurately said is that no Astral Claws surrendered to their fate. Each fought to the end, whether at the Palace of Thorns, in the hive cities of Badab, or in defense of the High Guard orbital station. The Astral Claws sold their lives in a blaze of fury, and spite. At dawn of the second solar day of the assault, the Carcadons took matters into their own hands to bring about the end. Assigned by Lord High Commander Caraban Colin the task of attacking the planet's infrastructure and preventing an organized defense from taking root, they had devised their own plan for doing so, and set their own deadly measures to the extremes to which they would go. Having already ravaged the Tyrant's Legion forces, defending the cities, and setting the hives ablaze, they continued to the final state of their plan, and dispatched the strike teams deep into the hive's subsurface. The Carcadons sabotaged the ancient atomic and geothermal reactors which powered the world's hive city, and fed its hungry planetary defense batteries with energy. Across Badab Primaris, power failed, or suddenly spiked, adding to the chaos, and slowly the hives began to quake, and the towers of Badab toppled. This resulted in a planetary tectonic upheaval, with entire hive city sectors collapsing into yawning chasms that opened up in the ground beneath them, replaced by seas of molten lava. Silently, and in good order, the Carcadons began to withdraw from the surface. The fatal blow struck for the God Emperor's judgment had been delivered on treacherous Badab. The sudden destabilization of power offered the Loyalists a much-needed opening in which to strike. As the lightning field in the Citadel's other defenses flickered for a moment, allowing the Star Phantom's assault force to breach the lower-level bunker network and catacombs before the Citadel could draw power again from their own reactors. With Captain Zukral Androcles at the fore, his assault marines and terminators forced their way into the Citadel and the heart of the enemy. The Star Phantom's assault was brutal and relentless. His passage blasted through by the Thunderhammer, rent bulkheads in charge, blown walls, while the Astral Claws that fought against them were the most fanatical and hate-filled of their breed. Their crimson-splattered armor devoid of any sign of their former service as defenders of the Imperium. Massive upheaval in the planet's sub-hive structures radiated out across the ancient geological fault lines, spewing molten magma and radioactive ash up from the earth. Badab Primaris began to die. At the Palace of Thorns, the bastion wall was finally breached, collapsing the lightning shield. The Star Phantom stormed the rubble-strewn remnants of the Citadel. As Dark Fate would have it, Androcles' own detachment encountered none other than Huron and his elite bodyguard, endeavoring to make their escape from their homeworld through these subterranean passages. It is likely Huron's party were attempting to flee to a concealed escape craft via the subsurface. The battle that followed was swift and bloody. The Star Phantom's force was wiped out to an Astartes. But data recovered from the power armor of the slain Star Phantoms and Astral Claws in the combat's aftermath revealed that Captain Androcles was struck down by the Tyrant in confrontation, who in his arrogance strode over the fallen hero, believing him dead. As his life bled from him, with his dying strength, the grimly determined Androcles managed to unleash a Melta blast at point-blank range into the Tyrant of Badab, dealing him a mortal blow. The Melta blast struck the arcane lightning claw the Tyrant habitually wore, which catastrophically exploded and unleashed a baleful pulse of energy. This blast incinerated the Tyrant's arm and much of his right side, and the remnants of his burning armor collapsing to the ground was the last image recorded by the fallen Star Phantom's captain's autosenses. Soon afterward, when a second Star Phantom squad entered the vault, they found the bloody remains of the melee, along with shrapnel and organic detritus, later identified by the Magos biologists as the Constitutorial Court as belonging to identified by the Magos biologists of the Constitutorial Court as belonging to the Tyrant. The bulk of Huron's body, however, was not found, nor were any remnants that could be later identified as belonging to the Astral Claws. Master of the Forge, Armenus Valtix, who had been present in the combat. Further investigation of the matter, or deeper exploration of the lower levels of the Palace of Thorns, proved impossible as the wider situation on Badab Primaris began to deteriorate rapidly. Beneath the hive of Badab Primaris, the cascading destruction of the reactor cores took its toll. The tectonic shock and volcanic eruptions increased at an exponential rate, causing the campaign of purgation and conquest on Badab to quickly devolve into an anarchic retreat. Boy, this is taking forever. Many were caught in the path of destruction. Vessels of any and all kinds were commandeered by both loyalists and secessionists alike in desperate effort to flee. In the anarchy and ruin that followed the destruction of the hive cities, the majority of the planet's population was estimated to have been exterminated in a manner of solar days. As confusion reigned in the wreckage star system, several loyalist transports were also shot down by the loyalist blockade ships. It is believed that at least one warp-capable privateer vessel managed to escape the Badab system into the Imperium. Later intelligence reports suggest that less than 200 Astral Claws were aboard, led by Armenus Valtix and carrying their master's broken body. The Badab War was finally over. Yay. Aftermath. Trial and Punishment. In the aftermath of the death of Badab Primaris, the remaining successionists from the Astral Claws, Executioners, Mantis Warriors, and Lamenters chapters were put on trial before the specially convened consistorial court, judges of their peers, with their very existence at stake. Despite the attempts of Inquisitor Legate Jardice Frayne to have the matter placed fully under inquisitorial remit, a conclave of 5 Space Marine chapter masters, whose forces were not part of the conflict, were convened in judgment in accordance with Adeptus Astartes tradition. Representatives of those that fought on both sides went on to give evidence to the court. Particularly noteworthy was the testimony of Captain Mirsan of the Salamanders, speaking out in eloquent and moving defense of the Executioners chapter's honor, if not their actions. Also heard at great length was the now near-dead master of the Firehawks, Stibor Lazarek, and his bitter calls to eradicate the vanquished foe without exception garnered some sympathy from the tribunal. The last to testify was the Inquisitor Legate Frayne himself, whose impassioned and wise words called on the assembled chapter masters to weigh both the deeds of men and the will of the Emperor, and heed the judgment of history unto them. An unanimous verdict was reached by the tribunal that the Astral Claws were judged to be traitors, most foul, and that they were to be declared excommunicati traitoris. They were guilty of taking up arms against the Imperium and the Emperor, and deceitfully causing their brethren to do likewise. The court also found that all those chapters who had taken part in the Badab succession was guilty in breaking with both the Codex Astartes and the ancient covenant within the Emperor that it represented. In punishment, all Astral Claws in Imperial custody were blindfolded and shackled in dishonor, and then put to the sword. It was further judged that the other surviving successionist chapters would have to each undertake a 100 standard year-long penitent crusade to atone for their transgressions, and would have to do so without the right to recruit new brethren to replace their losses during this time of punishment. Their future survival would, therefore, be left in their own hands, and by the grace and benevolence of the Holy Emperor. In addition, the Mantis warriors would henceforth lose all rights to their ancient domains in the Endymion cluster, with their goods and chattels given over to the Firehawks in perpetuity, and likewise the Lamenters chapter were condemned to surrender reparations in starships and war gear to the Minotaurs chapter. This in essence being no more than a rubber stamp approval of actions that had already taken place. The Executioners chapter, in contrast, were granted a measure of comparable clemency, and their twin chapter worlds were given over in trust to the Salamanders chapter, and their own successors rather than forfeited entirely, to be returned to them should they endure their 100-year act of contrition and survive. As the mortal men and women of the Maelstrom Zone caught up in a solar decade of calamity and bloodshed, their lives now belonged to the Administratum. Alongside them were the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Inquisition, both of which had their own interests to serve, and all would have their due. It's longer. The Star Phantom's Prize. In recognition for their efforts in the war's brutal final assault, the badly mauled Star Phantoms chapter was given the somewhat pyrrhic reward of dominion over the once proud Badab sector, along with the task of policing its survivors by edict of the Inquisition legate. Though the Star Phantoms were now reduced to less than a third of their former strength, ruling over a kingdom of ashes, they had long been a fleet-based chapter, having lost their former homeworld centuries before. They eagerly grasped their laurel of victory, as their just and long-labored reward. With the pick of the sector's worlds for their choosing, the Star Phantoms brought their severely damaged battle barge, Memento Mori, down to the surface of the ice world of Yahaga, in the Archaea system, to serve as their core for a new fortress monastery. Slowly began the process of rebuilding their chapter. Sorrow Tranquility. With the arrival of fresh Imperial Navy task force redeployed to be based on Venaya and Administratum Auditors emplaced on Sagan, the other loyalist Space Marine forces, having completed their operations in the Maelstrom Zone, began to depart their chapter world and wars afresh. The care of the Maelstrom Zone was now in other hands, and the provenance of new masters. It was only when the Red Scorpion Sword of Ordo, the last of the loyalist battle barges, was taking leave to depart Venaya on the long voyage back to Zybeus Minoris, that news reached the system of a darker fate that had befallen the Tranquility system. Before departing the Maelstrom Zone, the Carcadon's chapter fleet returned to the Endymion cluster. There, with the agreement of the Firehawks, they struck at the Tranquility system, whose worlds were once the primary recruiting and training grounds of the Mantis Warriors chapter. From these worlds, they harvested an entire generation to renew their own losses, forcing those selected to fight to the death to prove their worth in order to survive in the Carcadon's brethren. Thus paid in blood, the Carcadon's fleet departed, the last known sighting of them made by an exploratory augury beacon, which marked them taking course through the warp, ascending the galactic plane into the blackness of the outer void once more. Expurgation. On returning to Holy Terra and with the last act before he discharged his legatine authority, Inquisitor Jardinais Frayne ordered an edict of obliteration to be carried out under the auspices of the Adeptus Terra in regards to the Astral Claws, the Tiger Claws, and their master Huron. The task therefore began of whipping their accursed name and their sins from the pages of Imperial history. Sanitized and altered versions of the events of the war began to enter the official record, distorting nomenclature and reference at first stage of eventual total purgation, while an Inquisition enforced data pogrom to unmake extraneous or morally unworthy facts concerning the Badab War was conducted. The eye of the Imperium then moved on to the next crisis in the galaxy consumed by conflict. But we're not done. The rise of Huron Blackheart. Are we, mankind, then doomed to be always the father of our own torment, the genesis of our own destruction, time and time again? God Emperor help us. Ever has it been so. Ordo Hereticus Secret Report, author unknown. Though badly maimed by a multi-multa blast, the Tyrant of Badab yet lived. Though one side of his body was entirely reconstructed with bionics, the tech marines and apothecaries of his former chapter standing long vigil over him. On the 8th solar day, the Tyrant could speak again and order his fleet to seek a new world to conquer within the Maelstrom. By the 12th day, Huron could stand and don his power armor once more. His fanatical followers hailed his recovery as a miracle. But if it was any kind of miracle, it was a dark one. Huron's limited forces easily overwhelmed the first pirate stronghold they found, slaughtering all the human corsairs within. The survivors swore allegiance to the tyrant and became his slaves, soon learning to fear his fury. Lufgt Huron was reborn as the Chaos Lord Huron Blackheart, master of the Red Corsairs, lord of the Maelstrom and the Blood Reaver. Now that he had acquired more ships and men, the Blackheart embarked upon building an empire worthy of his rule. His dreaded Astral Claws followers then became the Red Corsairs, after their blood-red color they used to obliterate their old Imperial iconography and symbols, becoming a piratical Renegade warband of Chaos Space Marines that established a potent Chaos Empire within the warp rift of the Maelstrom, to rival that of the Eye of Terror. To this day, many of those few Space Marines who have tragically fallen to the lure of Chaos are inevitably found within the ranks of the Red Corsairs, embittered and twisted by the evil power of Chaos that reigns supreme within this hellish realm. The crimson artifice chosen by his followers as their warband colors and iconography pleased Huron greatly, and all of the renegade space marines who have since joined him have taken these colors as their own, to show their new allegiance. By early 927 of the 41st millennia, of course, the first reports reached all Imperial authorities of attacks from Corsair forces operating in and around the Maelstrom, which had worsened considerably. Although other than the Pale Stars region, the rest of the Maelstrom Zone largely, and appeared deliberately, remained unaffected. Vessels and agents sent in the region began to uncover rumors of powerful new Corsair lords operating within the Maelstrom, leading a warband of crimson-daubed heretic Astartes, seeming to owe no allegiance to any prior known faction, and operating with extraordinary ferocity and tactical discipline. The Corsair Lord was said to style himself Huron Blackheart. And so, the Tyrant of Badab lived on to torment the servants of the Emperor in the dark days to come.